The Rectory, St. Mary's at Withycombe in the Vale, in the parish of Withycombe in the county of Devon, the 26th day of December in the year of our Lord 1819. Dear Miss Wycliffe, I write to you in the candid, sober sorrow of a parish clergyman who has lately attended at the deathbed of a parishioner, and in the further capacity of a man entrusted by that parishioner with a duty he is now obliged to discharge. Mrs. Wilhelmina Trevanion of Trevanion Court, in this parish, who I am told stood as godmother to you at your baptism at St. Edmund's, Salisbury, in the November of 1794, departed this life on the cool, pale blue Friday morning of the 19th of November, 1819, in the 75th year of her age, having taken the rites of the established church at my own hand at 5:30 of the previous evening, in the calm, sober gravity that had attended the closing 6 months of her decline. She was buried at the south churchyard wall of this parish on the 23rd of November. Mrs. Trevanion, in the will she executed at this rectory the 8th day of July 1819, in the presence of myself and her solicitor, Mr. Geoffrey Locksley of Lincoln's Inn, London, did devise and bequeath to you the dwelling house known as Trevanion Court with its park and home farm of 316 acres, the South Library of 401 volumes, the Trevanion family plate, the sum of £3,800 in the 3% consolidated annuities, and the small portrait of her dear friend, your late mother, Mrs. Faith Wycliffe née Treloar, painted at 16 years of age at Salisbury, and lately hung above the South Library writing table. Mr. Locksley requires your attendance at his chambers at No. 7, Old Square, Lincoln's Inn, at 10:30 of Wednesday the 12th of January 1820 for the formal reading of the will and the receipt of the bequest. The household here at Trevanion Court awaits you. Mrs. Hibbert, the housekeeper of 32 years at this house, sends her sober welcome with my own. I remain, my dear Miss Wycliffe, with sober country gravity, your most obedient servant in Christ, Gervas Locke, Curate of St. Mary's, Withycombe in the Vale. Postscript, in a different hand below. My dear Miss Wycliffe, I have known of you these many years from my dear lady. I shall be at the south door at any hour you come. Henrietta Hibbert. The foolscap was laid down upon the green baize of the schoolroom writing table, and the young woman who had read it through twice now read it through a third time, slowly, in the cool, clear, pale blue light that came in at the leaded west window of 14 the Close, Salisbury, on the 8:30 hour of the Tuesday morning of the 28th of December. Miss Harriet Wycliffe, 25 years of age, soft, mid-brown hair pinned plain beneath an unadorned dark cap, sober hazel eyes very direct, fair, fine indoor skin, modest and upright in her unadorned slate-grey wool, half-mourning gown with its clean white linen collar, did not weep. She had not wept on the Boxing Day morning 2 days earlier when she had opened the letter for the first time. She had not wept on Christmas Day, when the letter had lain unopened on the corner of the writing table beside her aunt's morning letter from Bath. She would not weep now. At her right hand, set carefully upon the green baize, a hand's breadth from the curate's foolscap, was the silver christening cup. The cup was the size of a wineglass, slender at the stem, with a worn engraving along the bowl that her thumb knew by heart, from W.T. to her dear goddaughter Harriet, born 17th November 1794 at St. Edmund's, Salisbury. It was the only physical token she had of the woman the letter named her godmother. It had stood at the writing tables of her childhood. It had travelled to Bath with her after her father's burial. It had come back with her to the Close at Salisbury in the September of 1818. She had handled it perhaps 100 times in her life, and at no hour had it weighed in her hand as it weighed at this hour. The schoolroom around her was empty. The Christmas holiday week of Mrs. Fitzgerald's reading school had begun the previous Friday, and the 7 boarding pupils had gone home to their families at Devizes and Andover and Romsey and Wilton. The fire in the schoolroom grate was banked low. A clock at the far wall ticked. The cool, pale blue Salisbury light fell upon the curate's foolscap and upon the silver cup and upon her hand. She had been born in the November of 1794 at the Close, the only child of her father, the Reverend Bartholomew Wycliffe, parish curate of St. Edmund's, Salisbury, and her mother Faith. In the March of 1812, when Harriet was 17, her mother had died of a spring fever. In the autumn of 1817, when she was 23, her father had followed of an autumn fever of the same low kind. Her aunt, Mrs. Helena Trelaw at Bath, had kept her through the long year of 1817 to 1818 in candid filial kindness, and in the September of 1818, Mrs. Fitzgerald's reading school in the Close had taken her as second mistress at the customary salary, and there she had been at her writing table for 15 months. That was her history, set out as she would have set it out in her own hand to a stranger. There was little else of fact to add, for hers was the unornamented record of a clergyman's only daughter at a cathedral close, a childhood of catechism and copybooks and her father's parish duties, an adolescence of her mother's last illness, and her own beginning at her father's library shelves, a young womanhood of nursing her father through the close of his life and of the duties of the parsonage. And now, this 15th-month interval of the reading school, in which she had taught the junior girls their writing and their elementary French and their needlework, and had taken her meals at Mrs. Fitzgerald's parlour, and had walked the cathedral cloister on the dry afternoons. Of Mrs. Wilhelmina Trevanion of Trevanion Court in the county of Devon she had heard, in her 25 years, 4 times. The first hearing had been the silver cup itself, given her by the post at her 10th birthday at the Close in the November of 1804, in a small flannel-lined wooden case with a card in a hand she had not known. For Harriet, on her 10th year. W.T. Her mother had taken the cup up in her hand, and had said in a register Harriet had not heard her mother use of any other living woman, that it was from her dear Willie. Her mother had set the cup upon the parlour mantel, and had said no more. The second hearing had been at the close of her mother's life, in the spring of 1812. Her mother, in the last week of the fever, had spoken once, to her father at the bedside, of her dear Willie at Devon, and had said she hoped her dear Willie would be told. Her father had answered, in the candid grave register he used of all sober matters, that he would see to it. Harriet, 17 and at the bedside, had not asked. The third hearing had been the bundle she had found in her late mother's writing desk after her father's burial in the October of 1817. The desk had stood in the parlour at the Close 5 years untouched since her mother's death. Her father had kept it locked, with the key in his own waistcoat, and had not spoken of opening it. And Harriet, at 23, charged with the close of the parsonage, had opened it. Inside, in a small ribboned bundle, had been 8 letters in a careful copperplate hand on plain cream paper, dated between the May of 1801 and the September of 1809, addressed to Mrs. Faith Wycliffe at the Close, Salisbury, signed in the same hand at the close of each. Your most affectionate Willie. Harriet had read them through at the parsonage parlour on a candle, at 23, in the candid sober gravity of a young woman closing her father's house. She had laid the bundle aside in a tied silk wrapper at the bottom of her own writing case. She had not opened the wrapper since. The fourth hearing had been the curate's letter. She had received the curate's letter at the schoolroom on the Christmas Eve evening by the Salisbury and Exeter mail coach guard, who had handed it in at the kitchen door at 5:45 in the dark and the falling sleet, with the parish wax of St. Mary's at Withycombe in the Vale at the seal and her name at the face in the careful Devon hand of the writer. She had carried it to the schoolroom writing table and laid it upon the green baize and had not opened it. Her aunt's letter from Bath had come by the morning post of that same Christmas Eve, candid in its filial requests, and she had answered her aunt at the candle that night. She had spent Christmas Day at Mrs. Fitzgerald's parlour with her employer and the cook, in the proper observance of the festival, and the curate's letter had lain on the schoolroom writing table behind a shut door. She had opened it on the Boxing Day morning at the 8:30 hour, alone at the schoolroom writing table, and had read it through twice. She had set down the foolscap. She had crossed the room to her writing case at the trunk, and had taken out the silver cup from its flannel lining, and had carried the cup back to the writing table, and had set it down at the right hand of the curate's letter. She had then sat for the length of 1 hour without moving, the cool, pale blue Boxing Day light at the leaded west window, the silver cup at her right hand, the foolscap at her left. She had not wept. She had not, at any hour of her father's burial 15 months earlier, wept beyond the proper compass of the parish service. And she would not weep now, for a benefactress she had never met, in a Devon parish she had never seen, who had left her a house and a library and a sum in the funds and a portrait of her own dead mother at 16. What she had done on the Boxing Day afternoon was to take down her writing paper and her pen, and to begin her 3 letters. The first had been to Mr. Geoffrey Locksley, at No. 7 Old Square, Lincoln's Inn, London. It had run to half a sheet only, in her candid italic. She had acknowledged the curate's letter at his solicitation. She had confirmed her attendance at his chambers at 10:30 of the morning of Wednesday the 12th of January, 1820. She had asked no question and had offered no remark beyond the necessary form. She had signed it, "Yours respectfully, Harriet Wycliffe," and had sealed it in a wafer for the morning post. The second had been to the Reverend Gervase Locke at the rectory of St. Mary's at Withycombe in the Vale. It had run to 3/4 of a sheet. She had thanked him for the office of his letter and for the gravity with which he had discharged a difficult duty. She had said that she had been a stranger to her godmother in life, and was sensible of how strange a thing it was to receive such a bequest from such a stranger. She had said that she was bound for Lincoln's Inn at the appointed hour, and that she would, if it accorded with Mrs. Hibbert's arrangement, present herself at Trevanion Court within the week following. She had asked him to convey to Mrs. Hibbert her thanks for the postscript, which she had read with sober gratitude. She had closed in her own candid italic. The third had been to Mrs. Fitzgerald, her employer at the reading school. She had given Mrs. Fitzgerald, in the customary 3-month notice required of a second mistress, her formal notice of departure in the November on the receipt of her aunt's letter from Bath, mentioning Mrs. Trevanion's illness. She had thought her aunt's mention worth the notice in proper form, even at the long chance that the illness might prove no more than a Bath rumour. The Boxing Day letter to Mrs. Fitzgerald therefore was not the giving of the notice, but the formal 6-week confirmation, naming the morning of Friday the 7th of January, 1820, as the day on which she would close her duties and present her keys. She had thanked Mrs. Fitzgerald for her kindness through the 15 months of her engagement. She had signed and sealed. She had taken the 3 letters to the post at the close, at 4 o'clock of the Boxing Day afternoon. She had walked back to the schoolroom in the cool, pale blue Salisbury winter dusk, and had sat at the writing table and had read the curate's letter through a 3rd time, the silver cup at her right hand, and had then taken her tea at the schoolroom hearth with Mrs. Fitzgerald's cook. That had been the Boxing Day. The day following, Monday the 27th of December, she had written to her aunt Mrs. Treloar at Bath, in the long, candid filial register her aunt was entitled to. She had set out the matter at 3 sheets, plain and unhurried. She had named the house and the acreage, and the library, and the sum in the funds, and the portrait of her own late mother. She had named Mr. Locksley at Lincoln's Inn and the appointed Wednesday. She had said that she would not, at this writing, attempt to set out what she felt of it, for she was not yet sensible of what she felt. She could only set out what she knew. She had asked her aunt's blessing on her undertaking, and had said that she would, in the course of the spring, come up to Bath at the first proper hour. The aunt's blessing came back by the Bath return post on the morning of Thursday the 30th of December at 9:15. The aunt, in her own candid hand, had given the blessing in the form of 3 sober sentences. The aunt would not press her by remark. The aunt would not counsel her at this hour. The aunt was glad. Harriet had folded her aunt's letter and had placed it in her writing case beside the bundle of her mother's 8 letters from her dear Willie, and had returned to her duties at the schoolroom. That had been the Thursday. It was now the Tuesday morning of the 28th of December, 8:30, and she was reading the curate's letter through a 4th time at the green baize writing table, the silver cup at her right hand. There was no one at the schoolroom but herself, and a clock at the far wall, and the banked low fire. She set down the foolscap at the close of the 4th reading. She took up the silver cup in her right hand and turned it once in the cool, pale blue window light, so that the worn engraving at the bowl caught for the length of one breath. From W.T. to her dear goddaughter, Harriet. She set the cup back upon the green baize. She thought of her mother, dead these 7 years and 9 months, who had spoken at the close of her life of her dear Willie at Devon, and who had said she hoped her dear Willie would be told. She thought of her father, dead these 2 years and 3 months, who had answered at the bedside that he would see to it. She thought of the bundle of 8 letters at the bottom of her writing case, in their tied silk wrapper, unopened these 2 years and 3 months. She thought of the godmother she had never seen, dead now these 5 weeks and 3 days, who had, at the 8th of July of the year, just closing executed at a Devon rectory, the formal instrument of an inheritance Harriet had not known to expect, and had not asked for. She thought of the house at Devon, which she had not seen, and of the parlour at the close at Salisbury, which she would not see again. She thought, in the candid, filial, sober register her father had taught her, that this was the alteration of her life. She did not weep. She rose from the writing table at the close of the 4th reading, and she went about her duties. The last 3 days of the Salisbury year were of the same cool, clear, pale blue weather, untroubled by sleet or wind. On the afternoon of Thursday, the 30th of December, at 3:30, she walked the cathedral cloister in her grey wool half-mourning, the cool, pale yellow winter sun at the cloister arches, and returned to the schoolroom at 4. She read the curate's letter once more at her writing table at the close of the afternoon, handled the silver cup once in her hand, did not weep, set the cup down at the corner of the desk, and went to her tea. On the afternoon of Friday the 31st of December at the same hour, she walked the cathedral cloister again. She read the curate's letter once more at her writing table at the close of the afternoon, handled the silver cup, did not weep, set the cup down, and saw out the year at the schoolroom hearth with the cook. The first week of January was the week of her packing. Her trunk was the same modest leather-bound trunk her father had purchased for her at Salisbury in the spring of 1812, with the W of Wycliffe in brass at the lid. Into it she put her half-mourning gowns, her clean white linen, her writing case, containing her aunt's letter, the curate's letter, her tied silk wrapper of the 8 letters, and her own commonplace book, her father's small pocket Tacitus, her mother's silver thimble, and her commonplace book. The silver cup she wrapped in clean white linen and laid at the top, where her hand could reach it through the strap. On the morning of Friday the 7th of January at 9:30, Mrs. Fitzgerald received her in the parlour of the reading school in sober, dignified leave. Mrs. Fitzgerald, who had known her father, said 3 sober sentences and offered her the customary character. Harriet thanked her at the same register, and presented the keys. The cook brought up Harriet's trunk to the south hall. The Salisbury post-chaise was at the door at 10 o'clock. The boarding pupils, returned from their holidays the day before, watched from the upper sash window in candid silence as Harriet climbed up. She broke her journey at Andover for the night, at a sober inn she had stopped at twice before, and went on to London on the Saturday by the Andover and London Road, arriving at Mrs. Bromhead's boarding house at No. 12 Carey Street, Lincoln's Inn, on the Saturday afternoon of the 8th of January at 4:30. Mrs. Bromhead, whom Mr. Locksley's chambers had recommended in their letter of the 30th of December, received her with sober London kindness, and showed her up to the small mahogany-furnished chamber at the second floor, with the leaded window at the west, looking down upon Carey Street. She spent the Sunday morning at the Lincoln's Inn Chapel, and the Sunday afternoon, and the whole of the Monday, at Mrs. Bromhead's writing-room, with her commonplace book and her writing-case. She did not unfold the 8 letters in their tied silk wrapper. She did not yet feel herself entitled to. She read through, on the Monday afternoon, the printed memorandum Mrs. Bromhead had given her at the Saturday arrival of the boarding-house's hours and customs. She took a half-sheet of her own commonplace book and set down at the head of it the date of the morrow and the hour of the appointment, and beneath it 3 sober lines of her own preparation, which she did not need to refer to, but the writing of which was her customary discipline at the eve of any sober undertaking. It was now the Tuesday evening of the 11th of January, at 9:30. Harriet sat at the small mahogany table by the leaded west window of Mrs. Bromhead's first-floor writing-room. A single trimmed lamp stood at the table. A coal fire burned low at the grate. The curate's letter was folded sober in her dressing-case at her left hand. She had taken it out once at the close of the afternoon, read it through, and folded it back. The silver christening cup, wrapped in its clean white linen, was at the top of her trunk in the chamber above, where her hand could reach it through the strap. The cool, clear, pale blue London January night stood at the leaded west window. From the Carey Street pavement below came once the sober tread of a watchman, and then the night was again at its proper hush. She had her commonplace book open at the small mahogany table, but she was not writing. Her right hand rested upon the green leather cover. Her sober hazel eyes were upon the leaded window without seeing the leading. She was sensible at this hour of an alteration in her own life. She would not yet attempt to name it. She knew only its shape, that the cool, pale blue Boxing Day morning at the Salisbury schoolroom writing table was at her back, that the fool's cap from a Devon parish she had never seen was folded sober in her dressing-case, that the silver cup from a godmother she had never met was at the top of her trunk in clean white linen, that her aunt at Bath had given her blessing, that her 3 sober letters had gone out in their proper form, that her notice was given at the schoolroom and her duties closed, that the morning would take her, in her unadorned slate-grey wool half-mourning, the 2 streets from Carey Street to Old Square, to be received at 10:30 by Mr. Locksley at No. 7. She closed the commonplace book. She turned the trimmed lamp lower. She rose at the small mahogany table, sober and upright in her unadorned slate-grey wool, and crossed the writing-room to the door, and took up her candle from the hall table, and climbed the stair to the second floor. In the chamber above, she set the candle at the dressing-case at the leaded west window. She undid the strap of her trunk at the foot of the bed, and laid her hand upon the clean white linen at the top, and felt through the linen the slender shape of the silver cup, and did not lift it out. She redid the strap. She went to her bed. The coal at the chamber grate settled with a sober sound. She would meet Mr. Locksley in the morning at 10:30. Wednesday morning, the 12th of January 1820, broke cold and pale blue over the slated roofs of Carey Street. At No. 12, Mrs. Bromhead's boarding house for gentlewomen, Harriet Wycliffe took her breakfast at 9:30 in the front parlour at the writing table by the window, her travelling trunk strapped at the foot of the narrow stair, her dark cap pinned smooth, her slate-grey wool half-morning gown brushed at the hem of the London streets it had been brushed against the previous evening. Mrs. Bromhead, a sober, elderly widow of 31 years lodging-keeping, set down the tea and went out without speech, knowing the morning to be one of consequence. Harriet had slept her 6 hours and a quarter. She had set the silver christening cup on the boarding-house mantel-shelf at her arrival on the Tuesday evening, and she did not now look at it. She drank 1 cup of weak tea, ate 1 slice of bread, paid Mrs. Bromhead the 7 shillings of the day's account, and at 10:20 took up her reticule and her plain umbrella, and went out into the pale blue Lincoln's Inn air. The walk was a half-mile by, the way she had been directed at the boarding-house door, and Harriet went it in the careful tread of a young woman who has been a schoolmistress at Salisbury Close these 16 months and knows the value of arriving at the hour appointed. Carey Street was empty, save for a coal cart and a lamp boy putting out the last gas lamp at the corner. She turned at Searle Street, came to the gate of Lincoln's Inn, and there found the customary old square fog clinging in soft pale ribbons at the iron railings, a fog that the January sun had not yet thinned. She passed beneath the gate and turned into the gravel walk of Old Square, where the lamp at number 7 still burnt yellow at the door against the grey-blue morning. At 10:30 precisely, the clerk, a thin sandy young man in a black coat, showed her up the stair. At the head of the stair, the door of the inner room stood open, and Mr. Geoffrey Locksley, senior partner at Locksley and Pertwee, these 32 years at the bar, came forward from his green-baized writing table with the careful gravity of a solicitor who has the funeral of a long-known client at his shoulder. He was a thin man of 60, with thinning silver-grey hair carefully combed back, grave grey eyes behind small gold-rimmed spectacles, a fair indoor pallor, a long narrow scholar's face, clean-shaven, the slight stoop of his long stair-climbing years. He wore unadorned black superfine, and the cuffs of his linen were very white. "Miss Wycliffe," he said, "thank you for coming up. Will you sit? The chair at the writing table, if you please. The morning is cold." Harriet sat in the upright chair he showed her. She set her reticule at her feet. Mr. Locksley took his own chair at the further side of the green-baized table, opened a folded leather portfolio at his elbow, drew out a sheet of parchment folded thrice, and laid it flat. The clerk withdrew and shut the door. "I have here," Mr. Locksley said, "the engrossed will of the late Mrs. Wilhelmina Trevanion of Trevanion Court in the parish of Withycombe in the Vale in the county of Devon, executed at the rectory of St. Mary's at Withycombe on the 8th day of July, in the year just gone, in the presence of myself and of the Reverend Gervase Locke, curate of that parish, and of Mrs. Henrietta Hibbert, housekeeper at the house these 32 years. The probate has been granted at Doctors' Commons on the 17th of December, last in the proper form. I shall not read the will entire. I shall read the bequest paragraph that concerns yourself, and the closing witness line. The engrossed copy will be in your hand at the close of our half-hour." Harriet inclined her head. Mr. Locksley settled his spectacles, drew the candle a little nearer for the pale morning, and read in the careful, flat tone of a solicitor reading what he had himself drawn. "I give and devise my dwelling-house called Trevanion Court, with the park, the home farm, and all messages and hereditaments thereto belonging, being together 316 acres in the parish of Withycombe in the Vale, in the county of Devon, unto Miss Harriet Wycliffe, only daughter of my late friend, Mrs. Faith Wycliffe, née Treleur, to hold to the said Miss Wycliffe her heirs and assigns for ever, in fee simple absolute, free of all encumbrances. together with the sum of £3,800 in the 3% consolidated annuities at present standing in my name at the Bank of England, the contents of the South Library being 401 volumes, the Trevanion family plate of 117 pieces, and the small portrait of my dear friend, Mrs. Faith Treloar, at 16 years of age, by an unknown Salisbury hand, lately hung above the South Library writing table. He paused. Harriet did not move. He drew a slow breath and read the witness line. Witness my hand and seal this 8th day of July, 1819. Wilhelmina Trevanion. Witnesses: Geoffrey Locksley, Solicitor; Gervase Locke, Curate; Henrietta Hibbert, Housekeeper. Mr. Locksley folded the parchment, set it gently at her hand of the green baize, and removed his spectacles to polish them at a corner of his linen. You will permit me, Miss Wycliffe, a few candid explanations. I had known your late godmother since 1804 as her family solicitor, that is to say, these 16 years. She was a gentlewoman of the kindest sober temper, and at no hour of her life had any quarrel with any creature. She suffered an 8-month decline upon a diagnosis given her by Dr. Pettifer of Exeter in the May of last year. Upon receiving that diagnosis, and not before, she made inquiry of me at this chamber concerning the circumstances of yourself. She had wished to do so for some years, but had felt herself, being a stranger to you in person, not qualified to apply. She wrote to me of her intentions by candid letter of the 14th of May. I sent down my Bath agent, who took candid information of you at the Close at Salisbury and at your Aunt Mrs. Treloar's house. By the close of June, her mind was settled. I came down to Devon on the 7th of July, and on the 8th the will was executed at the rectory in the presence of Reverend Locke and Mrs. Hibbert. Dr. Pettifer's affidavit of soundness of mind, sworn at the rectory on the 7th of July, is at this chamber and is at your disposal. Harriet inclined her head a second time. She said, I am obliged to you, Mr. Locksley. There is more, Miss Wycliffe. I shall give you, before you leave this room, the engrossed will copy you have at your hand. A small private letter from your late godmother of the 8th of July, sealed within the will packet and addressed to yourself. The Bank of England draft for £3,800, drawn at sight upon Threadneedle Street, and the address of Mr. Pendle, the steward at Trevanion Court, these 26 years, who will receive you and answer at any hour for the home farm. He passed the 4 articles across the green baize, one at a time. The parchment, the small folded letter sealed with grey wax bearing the impression of a Trevanion seal, the long blue paper draft, and a half-sheet bearing in his own clerical hand the steward's address. Harriet set them into her reticule with the unhurried care of a young woman who has not in her life had 4 such articles to set into a reticule at 1/2 hour. She drew the string of the reticule, closed it, and folded her gloved hands at her lap. Mr. Locksley, she said, Mrs. Trevanion was my mother's dear friend at Mrs. Champernowne's reading school at Salisbury, between 1782 and 1786. My mother spoke of her at the close of her life, by the name of her dear Willie. I had her silver christening cup from my late father's writing desk in the autumn of 1817. I had not in my life thought to come into anything further at her hand. I shall be at Trevanion on the Friday of next week. You will write to me at this chamber by any post, Mr. Locksley said, for any matter whatever. I am at your service for the term of your tenure, Miss Wycliffe. She rose. He rose. He showed her down the stair himself, called up the boarding-house chairman at the gate, and saw her into the chair. The old square fog had not yet thinned. The chairmen carried her back to Carey Street, and at 11 she was at Mrs. Bromhead's again, the reticule at her hand, the slate-grey wool gown unmarked by the London winter air. She did not open the private letter until the candle had been lit at her own chamber at 4:30, when the pale yellow London afternoon had drawn down to dusk at Carey Street. She drew the small folded sheet from the will packet, broke the grey wax with her thumbnail, opened the paper at the writing table, and read in the slow, candid tone she had used to read her late mother's letters at Salisbury. Trevanion Court, the 8th of July, 1819. My dear Miss Wycliffe, I have not in my life felt myself qualified to call upon you, being a stranger to you, and I have suffered this silence to grow long past its proper season. I knew your dear mother at Mrs. Champernowne's reading school at Salisbury when she was a girl of 12 and I a girl of 14, and I loved her then as I have loved her since. I have heard from Mr. Locksley's agent that you keep yourself in candid, sober industry at the close. I am leaving you Trevanion in the hope you will think of it as your own. Yours in candid, sober affection, Wilhelmina Trevanion. Harriet read the letter twice. She folded it again at the candle, set it within her mother's old writing desk, and went down to Mrs. Bromhead's parlour to take her supper at 6. She did not weep. She had not wept at the curate's letter at the schoolroom on Boxing Day, and she did not weep now. She slept that night the same 6 hours and a quarter, and at the close of the Thursday and Friday and Saturday, she had taken her leave of Mrs. Bromhead and engaged her inside seat on the Exeter mail at the White Bear in Piccadilly for the Monday dawn. Monday the 17th of January, 6 o'clock, the White Bear Yard at Piccadilly. The mail coach guard in his red coat blew the half-hour. The 4 horses stamped at the cold cobbles, and Harriet took the inside corner seat with her trunk on the roof and her reticule at her lap. The other 3 inside passengers were a sober, elderly clergyman of the Sarum diocese, a thin commercial gentleman with a brown leather case, and a stout farmer's widow with a basket. None spoke at the first stage. The coach rolled west along the Hammersmith Road in the still pale dawn. Breakfast was taken at 9:30 at the Angel at Andover, a respectable posting-inn at the High Street, with a panelled coffee-room and clean linen at the long table. Harriet had a slice of cold ham, a roll, and a cup of strong coffee, while the team was changed in the yard. At 10:15, the guard called the coach, and they were away again at the careful trot of the Exeter road. At noon, the mail rolled into Salisbury, and Harriet alighted at the Crown for 2 hours to take leave of her elder cousin, Mrs. Goodwood, at No. 9 the Close. Mrs. Goodwood, a sober widow of 48 in dark bombazine, received her at her front parlour, set out a cold luncheon at the small table, and asked after the bequest with the sober gravity of an elder cousin who has known the news a fortnight by the Salisbury post. They spoke of Mrs. Goodwood's 3 sons in the Sarum Cathedral School, of the late Reverend Wycliffe, whose memory was warm at the close, and of Harriet's mother. At 10 minutes to 2, Harriet rose, kissed her cousin at the cheek, and walked back to the Crown for the afternoon coach. The road then ran south-west by Salisbury Plain and Wincanton to the Somerset border, and from there into Devon by the long descent through the Blackdown Hills. Harriet noted little of it. She read at the inside lamp such pages of Cowper as she had brought in the reticule, set the book down at the closing of the light, and watched the leafless January hedgerows go by at the steady trot of the team. The other 3 inside passengers had been set down at Sherborne and Honiton. From Honiton, she had the inside to herself. At 9 of the Tuesday evening, the 18th of January, the Exeter mail came in at the New London Inn at Exeter. The yard was busy with the Falmouth and Plymouth coaches, but a sober chambermaid showed Harriet up to a quiet front chamber on the 2nd floor and laid her a small supper of broth, cold beef, and a half-pint of small ale. Harriet ate it at the deal table by the window, looking out at the lamplit Exeter Street. She slept 7 hours, an hour over her London quarter. At 8 of the Wednesday morning she came down, paid the bill of 17 shillings 6pence, and asked the porter to engage her a post-chaise for Withycombe in the Vale by way of Chudley and Bovey Tracy. The chaise was at the door at noon. 2 black horses, the postillion in customary Exeter scarlet, her trunk strapped behind. She settled at the inside seat with her reticule. The postillion cracked his whip, and they were away west on the cool, pale blue Devon afternoon. The journey took the rest of the Wednesday and a bright, cold Thursday in the lanes between Chudley and Bovey, with an overnight at a small posting-house whose name she did not afterwards remember. And at noon of the Friday, the chaise turned southwest by lanes that grew narrower and were edged with leafless Devon hedge and grey stone wall, descending the long slope above the Dart toward Withycombe. Friday the 21st of January, 4 o'clock of the afternoon. The chaise reached the lodge gates of Trevanion Court at the foot of a small ridge, 2 stone pillars in pale Devon granite, a wrought-iron gate already opened by a sober lodge-keeper in a brown coat, and beyond the gate, a long beech avenue running up a quarter of a mile of slow ascent to the south sweep. The beeches were leafless and tall against the pale yellow western light. The postillion took the chaise at the careful trot up the gravel. The gravel ran out at the wide south sweep, and the chaise drew up at the south porch at 12 minutes past 4. Harriet looked up through the chaise window. Trevanion Court was a house in the plain Devon gentry style of the middle of the last century. Rough cast, pale grey Devon granite, 2 stories with a low attic dormer row at the slated roof, a long south face of 9 windows of plain sash, the central pillared porch in the Doric carrying a pediment of pale stone, the south-facing slope of the Dart Valley running away behind the east wing. The house had been built by the late Sir Aldous' father about 1750, and it had the candid, sober gravity of a country gentleman's seat that had been kept these 70 years in the same family. No banners, no towers. A house. The south door stood open at the wide pillared porch, and at the threshold there waited a tall, thin, upright old man of 66 in unadorned black butler's tailcoat with worn silver Trevanion buttons. His hair was white and brushed back, his grey eyes finely lined and kind, his white cravat was very clean. This, by Mr. Pendle's address sheet, was Mr. Carrick, the butler, 36 years in the house. He came down the porch step, opened the chaise door himself, and inclined deeply. "Miss Wycliffe, you are welcome at Trevanion. The household has waited at the south door from the 3:30. Will you come in?" Harriet alighted, drew her cloak about her, and walked up the porch step. Within the south hall, a tall hall of pale cream wash, a black and white flagged floor, a long case clock at the foot of the staircase that softly chimed the quarter as she entered, stood the household drawn up in a single careful half-circle to receive her. At the centre, Mrs. Hibbert. She was as Harriet had known she would be, iron-grey hair beneath a clean white linen cap, sensible grey eyes very direct, slender upright at her full height, in unadorned dove-grey serge, half-mourning with a clean white lawn fichu at the throat, and at her hip the chatelaine of keys, the chatelaine of 32 years' service. Behind her right shoulder stood Mrs. Tregeagle the cook, ruddy-cheeked at 54, soft grey-brown hair beneath a large white linen cap, in unadorned dark blue print cotton, with a clean white apron and warm, kind hazel eyes. Behind her left shoulder stood her daughter, Miss Esther Hibbert, soft, mid-brown hair pinned smooth at the nape under a clean white lace cap, sensible hazel eyes, slender upright at 24, in unadorned dove-grey print cotton morning gown. At the side of the hall, set back at a candid 2 paces, stood Mr. Pendle the steward, sturdy upright at 5 feet 10, soft sandy grey hair just brushing his collar, candid hazel eyes faintly weathered from the long estate riding, in unadorned olive-drab country coat over a buff waistcoat. Beyond them, 4 understaff in Trevanian morning blacks, 2 housemaids, a kitchen maid, and a young footman, the 4 of them upright at the wall. Harriet stopped at the centre of the hall, set down her reticule on the small mahogany side table at her hand, and looked candidly at Mrs. Hibbert. "Mrs. Hibbert," she said, "I am sensible of how long you served my godmother. I shall be obliged if you will continue the household exactly as Mrs. Trevanion kept it." Mrs. Hibbert curtsied at the careful, sober inclination of a housekeeper of 32 years. "Miss Wycliffe, the household has been kept in the manner Mrs. Trevanion appointed, and it shall be kept so. If you will permit me, I shall present the staff at the South Library at the morning's 10:30, when you have rested." "I thank you. There is one matter at this hour. I should be obliged if I were put up in the smaller north wing chamber rather than in my late godmother's apartments. The east apartments are to be kept as Mrs. Trevanion left them." A small flicker passed at Mrs. Hibbert's grey eyes. Recognition and a sober gratitude that the new mistress had the candid good sense to make that arrangement at the threshold rather than at the morning. She curtsied a second time. "The north wing chamber is laid, Miss Wycliffe. The fire was set at 3. Will you come up?" Mr. Carrick brought up the small trunk himself with the young footman. The chaise rolled back down the avenue at the closing of the pale yellow afternoon. Harriet took her supper at 7 at the south parlour, at the small table that had been laid for 1. A clear broth, a piece of broiled trout from the Dart, a slice of cold mutton, and a glass of Madeira from Mrs. Trevanion's cellar, and went up to the north wing chamber at the 9:30. The chamber was a sensible plain room, with a low cream-papered ceiling, a small 4-poster bed in white dimity hangings, a writing table at the south window, looking out across the home park, and a fire that burned warm at the polished hearth. She read 10 pages of Cowper at the candle, set the book at the writing table, and slept 8 hours. Saturday, the 22nd of January at 10 of the morning, Mr. Pendle the steward came up from the home farm and was shown to the south library, where Harriet had taken her writing table at the south window. He brought his leather book of estate accounts under his arm, and the candid, hazel-eyed, sober gravity of a steward of 26 years. "Miss Wycliffe, with your permission I shall walk over the park and the home farm at this hour, that you may see what is in your hand." Harriet took her cloak and went out with him by the south door. They walked the long south sweep, crossed the home park by the lower carriage drive, came down to the home farm at the slope of the Dart Valley, and Mr. Pendle named to her, once and with the candid economy of a man who knows that lists belong in their book and not in the air, that the domain stood at 316 acres of home park and home farm together in the parish of Withycombes in the Vale, that the home farm was let on a 6-year lease to Mr. Trembath of the village at the customary rent paid Lady Day and Michaelmas, that the south orchard ran to 17 old Devon cider apple trees at the foot of the kitchen garden wall, and that the south-facing slope above the Dart had been her late godmother's particular pleasure for its bog violets in the spring. He showed her the home farm yard, and the dairy, the granary, and at the close of the walk, brought her back to the south porch at noon. Harriet thanked him in candid, sober gratitude, and went in to her cold luncheon. Sunday, the 23rd of January, at 10:30. Mr. Carrick had the small carriage at the south sweep at the customary hour. Mrs. Hibbert came up beside Harriet in her own dove-grey half-mourning, the chatelaine softly chiming at her hip, and they were driven the 3/4 of a mile down to the village of Withycombe and to the south porch of St. Mary's. The church was a low Devon perpendicular building in the same pale granite as the house, with a short tower and a slate-roofed nave. At the south porch stood the Reverend Gervase Locke himself, in his black cassock and white linen surplice, his sandy grey hair finely thinning, his blue-grey eyes behind their small gold-rimmed spectacles, candid and kind. He bowed deeply at Harriet. "Miss Wycliffe, you are welcome at St. Mary's. The Trevanion pew has been kept for you at the south aisle." He led her up the aisle. The parish, some 38 souls at the 11 o'clock service. The village shopkeeper and his wife, Mr. Trembath, the tenant farmer with his 3 sons, 2 cottagers' families, 3 elderly widows in their dark cloaks, the lodge-keeper and his wife, turned at her passing with the candid, sober curiosity of a country parish that has had its new mistress on the road a week and at last sees her. Harriet inclined her head at the right and the left as she went, took her seat in the Trevanion pew, a square box pew with a low oak door, 2 cushioned benches and the worn gilt of an old Trevanion lozenge at the panel, and bent at her prayer book. Reverend Locke gave the morning office in his gentle Devon voice. The sermon was a short, candid one upon the duty of charity at the season. The singing was led by the parish clerk in a sober tenor. At the close of the service, Reverend Locke came down at the south porch and named to Harriet the principal parishioners one at a time, and Harriet curtsied at each, and at 12 she was driven back up the lane to the south sweep at Trevanion Court. Her week thereafter took its candid shape, writing table mornings at the South Library, an estate walk with Mr. Pendle on the Mondays, the parish school's reading class at the Wednesdays at the Reverend Locke's settled arrangement, and the Sunday morning at St. Mary's, where the Trevanion pew at the south aisle had been kept her these 21 days. Sunday the 6th of February, the afternoon. Service had been at 11. The Reverend Locke had given a candid sermon upon the parable of the talents. Harriet had taken her seat in the Trevanion pew, had heard the singing of the parish clerk, and had come down at the south porch at 12 to give her usual word to Mr. Trembath, the tenant farmer and the village shopkeeper's wife. Mrs. Hibbert, in dove-grey half-mourning with the chatelaine at her hip, had walked at her side to the carriage. But at the south, Sweep Harriet had asked that the carriage be sent on ahead, and that she and Mrs. Hibbert should walk back the half-mile by the Home Park lane. They walked it. The afternoon was cool, pale yellow and clear. A sober Devon, February afternoon at the close of a hard frost, the leafless beech branches above the lane fine against the pale sky, the Home Park brown-green at the slope. Mrs. Hibbert kept 3 paces at Harriet's right shoulder, as a housekeeper of 32 years walks at her mistress, neither too close nor too far. They did not speak. There was no need. At the south door, Harriet stopped. She set her gloved hand on the cold, pale granite of the porch column, and she turned and looked west. The Home Park ran down at her left to the lower carriage drive. The south-facing slope of the Dart Valley opened beyond. Across the valley, the pale yellow afternoon lay upon the Devon hedgerows and the leafless beech copses, and beyond, 10 or 12 miles to the west, by the careful blue distance of the late winter air, the long line of the Tavistock Hills stood up clear against the pale sky, blue and sober and at a great distance, with one streak of slate-grey cloud at the further ridge. The sun was low and gentle at the southwest. A rook called once at the Home Park. Harriet looked at the Tavistock Hills for a candid, long moment. She did not speak. Mrs. Hibbert, 3 paces behind, did not speak either. Somewhere within the house the long case clock at the foot of the south staircase chimed the 4:15, and the sound carried softly out at the open south door. She was settled. The folded letter came up to the South Library at the Morning Post of Wednesday the 9th of February, 1820, set upon the silver salver by Mr. Curate at 10:30 of a cool, pale blue Devon hour. Harriet was at the South Library writing table at the parish accounts, the Withycombe Coal Fund subscriptions of the previous Saturday, sober items in single columns, ready for the Reverend Locke's inspection at the Rectory tea on Friday. And she did not, at the first glance, look up. Mr. Curate inclined at her elbow, and observed only that the seal of the letter was not a country seal. She turned it in her hand, and read at the wax the impression of Furnival's Inn. She broke it. The letter was a single sheet of London foolscap, neatly folded twice, in a clerk's careful copper plate, dated the 7th of February 1820, from Chambers at Furnival's Inn, Holborn, in the City of London, and subscribed by one Felton, barrister at law, on behalf of Sir Pelham Trevanion of Trevanion Lodge, at Powderham in the county of Devon. Harriet set her pen down upon the green baize at her right hand and read the letter through, beginning to end, at one sober reading. It went thus: Madam, I write to you upon the instruction of my client, Sir Pelham Trevanion of Trevanion Lodge at Powderham, who is the lawful heir at male tail under the Trevanion settlement of 1759 of the manor and lands known as Trevanion Court in the parish of Withycombe in the Vale. Sir Pelham proposes to bring a proceeding at Chancery, contesting the will of the late Mrs. Wilhelmina Trevanion, dated the 8th of July, 1819, upon the following 3 grounds, which I am instructed to state to you in candid form before any process is filed. Firstly, that by the Trevanion settlement of 1759, the manor at Trevanion Court was entailed to the male heirs of Sir Aldous Trevanion's father, and that the late Mrs. Trevanion, being a daughter, had no power of devise to any stranger to the family. Secondly, that the late Mrs. Trevanion was of unsound mind at the date of the said will, by reason of her 8 months' illness then subsisting, and that the said will is for that reason void at law. Thirdly, that the said will was procured by Mr. Locksley of Lincoln's Inn, and by Mrs. Hibbert, the housekeeper at Trevanion Court, by undue influence at the deathbed of the late Mrs. Trevanion. Sir Pelham desires me to put before you that he is willing, in family forbearance, to withdraw the proceeding upon receipt from the Trevanion estate of the sum of £5,500 and an annuity of £350 a year, payable to him for the term of his natural life. I am instructed to require an answer within 10 days of the date hereof, in default of which the said proceeding will be filed at Chancery on Monday the 20th of February next. I am, Madam, your obedient servant, Felton. Harriet read the letter a second time. She did not weep. She did not at the second reading alter her countenance at any sentence of it. She refolded the letter along its original creases, set it upon the green baize at her left hand, and took up her pen. She was aware at the third moment of her sitting that Mr. Carrick had not gone away from the south library door. He had set himself at the customary half-pace, beyond the doorway, in the candid wait of a butler who has seen at his own house a letter of an unfamiliar seal opened in his mistress's hand. Harriet inclined to him at the writing-table, told him in a single sentence that she would have the Withycombe post-receiving boy held at the south kitchen against an afternoon letter, and asked him to send up Mrs. Hibbert at her sewing. Mr. Carrick inclined and went down. Mrs. Hibbert came up at the customary 3 minutes. Harriet set the Felton letter at her hand, without preface, and went on writing at the green baize. Mrs. Hibbert read the letter through at the south sash window in the cool, pale blue light, refolded it at the same creases, laid it back upon the green baize at Harriet's left hand, and observed only in the sober Devon manner of a housekeeper of 32 years at the house, that Sir Pelham Trevanion of Powderham had been at Trevanion Court twice in the autumn of 1818, and once again in the spring of 1819, and that on each of the 3 occasions her late mistress had received him at the south parlour for the customary half-hour, and not invited him to remain to dinner. The matter, she added, had not been new to her late mistress. nor had her late mistress been at any hour deceived as to its nature. Harriet inclined to her at the writing table, by the same afternoon's post, carried out by the boy from the home farm to the Withycombe post receiving at the village smithy at 4 o'clock. There went a sober letter of 3 sentences from Miss Wycliffe of Trevanion Court to Mr. Locksley at No. 7, Old Square, Lincoln's Inn, enclosing the Felton letter and asking him to come up to Trevanion at his earliest convenience. She set the silver christening cup at the writing table corner, where she could see it, and she went back to the parish accounts. The Withycombe Coal Fund subscriptions were not at the closure of the South Library clock at 6 o'clock at the customary single-column footing. She added the 3rd subscription of the previous Saturday a second time, and closed the parish book at the candid foot. Mr. Locksley arrived on the Friday at 3:30 by the Exeter mail of the Wednesday night and the hired Withycombe post-chaise of the Friday afternoon. Mr. Carrick had the south door open at the sound of the wheels. Mr. Locksley set his portfolio at the South Library writing table, drew up an upright country chair, and read the Felton letter at his gold-rimmed spectacles in candid silence. Harriet sat at her own chair at the writing table opposite him, with her hands folded upon the green baize. Mrs. Hibbert, at the corner with her sewing in the proper form of chaperonage, did not lift her eyes. When Mr. Locksley had read the letter through twice, he set it upon the baize, removed his spectacles, polished them at the corner of his black silk handkerchief, set them back upon his nose, and observed candidly, in the Lincoln's Inn fashion of a man of 32 years at the bar who has seen at his chambers a great deal of vexatious matter of this sort, and has learned at his desk the proper short answers to it, Miss Wycliffe. The 3 grounds are without merit at law. He drew from his portfolio a thick paper of legal parchment folded in 4s, opened it upon the baize, smoothed it at the creases, and went on. The Trevanion settlement of the 7th of November, 1759, he observed, executed by Sir Aldous' father in his lifetime and recorded at the Exeter rolls, was a strict settlement of the customary form for 2 generations only, that is, an entail limited to the testator's son, Sir Aldous, 1748 to 1798, and to the testator's grandson. The testator had had, at the date of the settlement, 1 young son and no grandson. The entail had been so framed that it would expire at the death of the life in being then unborn, plus the customary 21 years. The said grandson had never been born. At Sir Aldous' death of the autumn of 1798, the entail had spent itself by operation of law. Mrs. Trevanion, as Sir Aldous' only surviving daughter, and as residuary devizes under the Trevanion family deeds of November 1798, had taken the manor at her father's death in absolute fee, and had held it from that day to her own in absolute power of devise. He set his forefinger upon the parchment at the operative clause and observed, "The entail is long spent." The second ground he answered in 3 sentences. He himself, in his proper capacity as Mrs. Trevanion's family solicitor since the autumn of 1804, had attended at the execution of the will at the rectory at Withycombe on the 8th of July, 1819, in the presence of the Reverend Gervase Locke and of Mrs. Hibbert, the housekeeper. Mrs. Trevanion had been at the date of the execution of sound mind and disposing memory. She had read the will through at her own hand, had observed 2 clerical errors at the 3rd paragraph, and corrected them in her own pen, had named the witnesses, and had signed at the South Rectory writing table in a firm, clear hand. Mr. Locksley drew from the portfolio a separate sheet on heavier paper, sealed with the seal of an Exeter notary, and laid it beside the settlement. It was the affidavit of Dr. Pettifer of Exeter, Mrs. Trevanion's physician through the long autumn of her decline, sworn at Exeter on the 7th of July, 1819, that is, on the very evening before the execution, attesting that Dr. Pettifer had attended at Trevanion Court at 3 o'clock of that afternoon, and had found his patient of sound mind, of clear speech, of settled memory, and of candid composure in the contemplation of her own approaching end. The affidavit had been taken at Mrs. Trevanion's own request, against precisely the manner of attack now contemplated by Sir Pelham. The third ground he answered in two. Mrs. Hibbert and the Reverend Locke had been the witnesses at the execution. They had not been the procurers of the will. The procurer of the will, if procurer were the proper term, had been Mrs. Trevanion herself. Mr. Locksley drew from the portfolio a third document, a candid letter of 3 pages in Mrs. Trevanion's own hand, dated from Trevanion Court on the 14th of May, 1819, that is, 2 clear months before the formal execution, and addressed to Mr. Locksley at his chambers, instructing Mr. Locksley in clear terms to draw a will, leaving Trevanion Court and its appurtenant lands to Mrs. Trevanion's goddaughter, Miss Harriet Wycliffe of Salisbury, on the candid ground that Harriet was the only daughter of Faith Traylor, whom Mrs. Trevanion had loved as a sister at Mrs. Champernowne's reading school at Salisbury in the years 1782 to 1786, and that no other legatee at law or affection had any claim upon her. The letter was in Mrs. Trevanion's firm hand, in her own ink, on her own paper, in a season when she had not yet been informed by Dr. Pettifer of the gravity of her decline. It was, Mr. Locksley observed, the candid record of a settled testamentary purpose entertained by the testatrix in good health and in full possession of her faculties 3 full months before her formal execution. He set the 3 documents in order upon the green baize at his right hand. The 1759 settlement, the May 1819 instructing letter, the Pettifer affidavit of July 1819, and added a 4th, his own short attestation as solicitor and witness, sworn at Lincoln's Inn at the probate granting on the 17th of December, 1819. Then he set his hands flat upon the baize and looked at Harriet. Harriet, in candid self-possession at the South Library writing-table, in her sober dove-grey wool half-mourning with the clean white linen collar she had worn at Salisbury, answered him in the form he had used to her. Mr. Locksley, the grounds appear to me to be without merit at law. Pray answer Mr. Felton in candid Lincoln's Inn fashion. Mr. Locksley inclined at the writing-table. He took up a fresh sheet of foolscap. On the Monday following, the 14th of February, 1820, at the South Library writing-table at 10:30 of the morning, with the Devon light coming in cool, clear, pale yellow at the south sash, Mr. Locksley drafted the formal answer to Mr. Felton's letter. He set out the 3 grounds in turn and answered them in turn, in the sober Lincoln's Inn manner of a senior solicitor, who had at his chambers over 32 years drafted a great many such answers, and who had learned at his writing-table the proper economy of an answer that need not condescend to its own indignation. He enclosed certified copies of the 4 documents, the Trevanion settlement of November 1759, with the operative clause as to the spent entail marked at the margin in his own hand, Mrs. Trevanion's instructing letter of the 14th of May, 1819, Dr. Pettifer's affidavit of soundness of mind, sworn on the 7th of July, 1819, and Mr. Locksley's own attestation as witness and probate solicitor. He added at the close of the answer a single sentence, observing that in the event the said proceeding were filed at Chancery notwithstanding the documents enclosed, the costs would be sought against Sir Pelham personally upon the candid Chancery ground of a vexatious suit instituted at the candid knowledge of its own want of foundation, He sealed the packet at the South Library at 2:30 with his Lincoln's Inn seal. It went out by the home farm boy to the Withycombe post receiving, and from there by the Exeter mail coach the same afternoon, addressed to Mr. Felton at his chambers at Furnival's Inn, London. Mr. Felton's reply came back at the Morning Post of Friday the 18th of February. Mr. Locksley read it at the South Library at the writing table at the 10:30, and laid it upon the baize beside the parish accounts. It was a shorter letter, and in a less confident hand. Mr. Felton acknowledged Mr. Locksley's submissions as to grounds 1 and 2, and observed that he had laid them before his client Sir Pelham. He observed further, however, that Sir Pelham might yet press the third ground upon the further evidence of one Becky Linley, a former undermaid at Trevanion Court, lately come into Sir Pelham's notice, who, Mr. Felton was instructed to understand, could give evidence as to an undue intimacy between Mrs. Hibbert and the late Mrs. Trevanion in the closing weeks at the South Bedchamber. Mr. Locksley read the letter twice. He inclined to Mrs. Hibbert at the corner. Mrs. Hibbert had laid her sewing in her lap, and asked her in candid form whether the name was known to her. Mrs. Hibbert answered that it was. Becky Linley had been taken on as an undermaid at the South Scullery in the spring of 1818, had served the customary year and a half without notice, and had been dismissed without character on the 11th of November 1819, 8 days before Mrs. Trevanion's death, on the candid ground of a small silver caudle spoon taken from the south pantry and found at the bottom of the girl's box at the customary close-of-quarter inspection. The dismissal was in the household book at Mrs. Hibbert's hand on the date stated. Mr. Pendle, the steward, had been present at the inspection. The Withycombe constable had been sent for, and the matter compounded only on the girl's leaving the parish at first light. Mr. Locksley took up his pen. He wrote a short second answer to Mr. Felton, of 3 sentences. The first observed that Miss Linley had been dismissed without character on the 11th of November 1819 for the candid offence of theft of a silver caudle spoon, the record of which dismissal stood at the household book in Mrs. Hibbert's hand, and was attested by Mr. Pendle the steward and by the Withycombe parish constable. The second observed that the testimony of a discharged servant of that character upon a matter of testamentary undue influence was at law worthless, and would be at hearing dismissed at the first reading. The third observed that Mr. Locksley would be obliged if Mr. Felton would either file the said proceeding at Chancery within the original 10 days, or candidly withdraw it. The letter went out at the same afternoon's post. There came no further letter from Furnival's Inn that week. On the Wednesday following, the 23rd of February, 1820, at 11:30 of the morning, a hired post-chaise from Powderham was heard at the south sweep. Mr. Carrick had not been informed of the call. He met the chaise at the south door in sober gravity, inclined to the gentleman who stepped down, and showed him into the south parlour at the customary distance. Sir Pelham Trevanion of Trevanion Lodge, at Powderham, florid and oily, sandy thinning hair carefully oiled forward at the brow, sallow at the cheek, with broken veins at the side of the nose, weak narrow chin, long upper lip, set in what he conceived to be a candid family expression, medium 5'9", upright with a soft paunch at the dark bottle-green wool tailcoat with its worn gilt buttons, primrose yellow silk waistcoat slightly stained at the lapel, buff pantaloons, top boots with brass tassels at the knee, a quizzing glass on a black silk ribbon at the second waistcoat button, was kept by Mr. Carrick's silent gesture at the worn turkey rug at the doorway for the customary 3 minutes before being offered the upright country chair at the south parlour writing table. The household had assembled at Mr. Locksley's silent arrangement of the previous afternoon. Harriet sat at an upright country chair at the south parlour hearth in her sober dove-grey wool, half mourning with the clean white linen collar, her hands folded upon her lap. Mrs. Hibbert sat at the corner of the south parlour at the second sash window, with her sewing laid open at her knee in the proper form of chaperonage. Mr. Locksley sat at the south parlour writing table at the centre of the room, the 4 documents at his right hand in the order of his answer of the 14th, the 1759 settlement, the May 1819 letter, the Pettifer affidavit, his own attestation. The Reverend Gervase Locke, at Harriet's request, sat at the south library next door, against the possibility of the household's needing a clerical witness. He had a parish book open at his knee, and the door at his side stood ajar by the breadth of 2 fingers. Mr. Carrick stood at the south parlour doorway in his sedate gravity of a butler of 39 years at the house. Sir Pelham did not at once take the offered chair. He cast at the south parlour the candid family glance of a gentleman acquainting himself, at his proper deliberation, with what he conceived to be the disposition of an apartment lately come within his interest. The worn Turkey rug, the mantel-shelf clock, the row of Trevanian miniatures over the south parlour writing table, the candid family portrait of Sir Aldous at the north wall above the upright country chair, the small pencil portrait of Mrs. Trevanian's mother in the recess by the south sash window, and, at the close of his survey, set his quizzing glass to his eye for half a moment at the family portrait of Sir Aldous, made a small candid noise at the back of his throat, and took the chair Mr. Carrick's silent gesture had indicated. He did not look at Harriet at the upright country chair at the hearth. He did not at any moment of the call look at Mrs. Hibbert at the corner. Sir Pelham, in the candid family expression he had brought down from Powderham, set his quizzing glass at the silk ribbon and addressed himself to Harriet. He had come, he said, in the candid hope that the matter between them might be settled in the family. He had been gravely sorry to be obliged to instruct his man at Furnival's Inn upon a course so distasteful to his own gentlemanly feeling. He was sensible, he said it twice, that Miss Wycliffe was a young woman of sober good sense, who would see, upon proper reflection at the south parlour writing table, that the manor at Trevanian was a family matter, and that family matters were not for the courts. He would be obliged to her if she would suffer him to put before her, candidly and at her own south parlour hearth, the form of compromise his man had outlined in the letter of the 7th. Harriet, in candid self-possession at the upright country chair, heard him out without interruption. She did not at any moment of his speech alter her countenance. When he had done, she inclined a quarter of an inch at Mr. Locksley. Mr. Locksley took up the 4 documents in order. He read aloud the first paragraph of the Trevanian settlement of November 1759, and the operative clause as to the 2-generation entail. He set the parchment at Sir Pelham's elbow, and observed that the entail had spent itself at Sir Aldous' death of October 1798, and that Mrs. Trevanian had taken the manor in absolute fee from that day. He read aloud the 3rd paragraph of Dr. Pettifer's affidavit of soundness of mind of the 7th of July, 1819, and laid the affidavit at Sir Pelham's elbow upon the settlement. He read aloud the 2nd page of Mrs. Trevanian's instructing letter of the 14th of May, 1819, Mrs. Trevanian in her own firm hand, 3 months before the execution, candidly directing that Trevanian be left to her goddaughter Miss Harriet Wycliffe of Salisbury, and laid the letter at Sir Pelham's elbow upon the affidavit. He observed, at the close, that the undermaid, Becky Linley, had been dismissed without character on the 11th of November, 1819, for theft of a silver caudle spoon, and that her testimony as to testamentary undue influence was at law worthless. Sir Pelham's florid complexion altered at the reading of the May 1819 letter. The hand that held the quizzing glass set the glass down at the silk ribbon. He had not. His expression said, "Suppose that any such letter was at Mr. Locksley's chambers." He recovered after a sober pause, and observed that family matters were not always to be settled at law alone, that there were considerations of sentiment, of customary expectation, of the dignity of an ancient name. Harriet inclined to him a second time. "Sir Pelham." "You have my answer in one sentence. My late godmother, Mrs. Trevanion, made her will at this house on the 8th of July, last in the fixed and candid mind of a woman of 74 years. Mr. Locksley holds her instructing letter of the 14th of May, 1819, and Dr. Pettifer's affidavit of soundness of mind of the 7th of July, 1819. The 1759 Trevanion settlement was a strict settlement for 2 generations, and is long spent at Sir Aldous' death of 1798. Your chancery proceeding is without foundation at law, and I shall not pay 6d. to secure its withdrawal. Mr. Carrick, his lordship is leaving us. Good day, Sir Pelham." Sir Pelham opened his mouth. He closed it. He set his hand at the brass tassel of his right top boot, found nothing there to say, and rose. Mr. Carrick, who had not moved from the south parlour doorway through the exchange, inclined the half-inch he had inclined to Mrs. Trevanion at her own south door for 39 years, and showed Sir Pelham out to the south sweep. The chaise was at the customary distance. The postboy was at the head of the off-leader. At 20 past noon, by the south porch clock, the hired post-chaise rolled away east toward Powderham along the long beech avenue, and Mr. Carrick closed the south door at his own hand. His incline at his return to the south parlour was that of a butler of 39 years' service, who had seen his late mistress vindicated at the post-chaise. He did not speak. He set the south parlour door at the customary closure, and went down to inform Mrs. Tregeagle at the south kitchen that there would be 3 at the dining table at 4 o'clock. Mr. Locksley, at the south parlour writing table, gathered the 4 documents in the order in which he had read them, set them in his portfolio, and inclined to Harriet at the hearth. Harriet inclined to him. Neither of them spoke. Mrs. Hibbert took up her sewing. The separate inquiry came back the following evening. Mr. Locksley had, at his first reading of the Felton letter at the South Library on the Friday previous, written by the same afternoon's post to his London correspondent at the Westminster Bar, with instruction to ascertain the state of Sir Pelham Trevanion's affairs at the Pall Mall houses. The correspondent's answer came up by the Thursday evening Exeter mail, was set upon the silver salver by Mr. Carrick at the South Library at 7:30, and was read by Mr. Locksley at the lamp. Sir Pelham, the correspondent reported, was at the date of writing indebted at 4 Pall Mall gambling houses in the aggregate sum of £5,400. The largest single bond, £2,000, was held by Mr. Crockford at his new establishment in Pall Mall. The remainder was dispersed among 3 other houses of the customary character. Sir Pelham's barrister at Furnival's Inn, Mr. Felton, could not in any event file the contemplated proceeding at Chancery without prior receipt of a retainer of 50 guineas. Sir Pelham had, within the previous fortnight, applied for the said retainer at 4 separate sponsor houses in the city, and had at each been refused, at the first 3 upon the candid ground of his existing Pall Mall obligations, and at the 4th upon a candid further ground that Mr. Locksley of Lincoln's Inn had been before him at the sponsor's writing table that very morning with a sober statement of the documentary position at Trevanion. The proceeding, the correspondent observed, could not be brought. Mr. Locksley folded the correspondent's letter, set it upon the South Library writing table beside the Felton letter of the 7th, and inclined to Harriet at the lamp. He observed only that Sir Pelham would not be heard of again. Mr. Felton's formal letter of withdrawal arrived at the Morning Post of Tuesday the 1st of March, 1820. It was a short letter of 4 sentences upon his clerk's foolscap. It was sealed at the Candid Furnival's Inn seal. It contained no apology and no further reference to the undermaid. Mr. Locksley laid it upon the South Library writing table beside Mrs. Trevanian's May 1819 instructing letter, and observed that the threat was at an end. He took his own leave at the south door at noon. He had his portfolio at his hand and the Withycombe post chaise at the south sweep to carry him to the Exeter mail. Mrs. Hibbert had laid up a basket from Mrs. Tregeagle at the south kitchen, a candid Devon ham, a pot of damson conserve from the home farm, a half of Mrs. Tregeagle's saffron cake for his journey. He had at the parting given Harriet at the South Library writing table that morning the 4 documents in a stout sealskin packet sealed at his Lincoln's Inn seal, and had observed in candid Lincoln's Inn fashion that the packet should be set at the South Library cupboard at the back of the Green Baize estate shelf against the candid contingency of any further matter of the same character at any hour of the next 30 years. He had further observed that Mr. Felton at Furnival's Inn was a competent man and not a dishonourable one, and that his withdrawal of the proceeding was to be received as the answer of a barrister who had read his client's documents through at a candid hour and discharged the proper professional duty in the proper Furnival's Inn manner. Harriet inclined at her writing table, Mr. Locksley inclined at the South Library doorway. Mr. Carrick had the south door open at the customary distance. Mr. Locksley inclined at the south door to Harriet at the south porch. Harriet inclined at the south porch to Mr. Locksley at the south door, and the post-chaise rolled away east along the beech avenue at 12:20. Mr. Carrick closed the south door at his own hand. On the Friday following, the 4th of March, 1820, at 3:30 of a cool, clear, pale yellow Devon afternoon, Harriet sat at the South Library writing table at the parish accounts she had set aside 3 weeks before. The Felton withdrawal letter of the 1st of March lay folded sober at her left elbow upon the green baize, the seal turned downward. Mrs. Hibbert had banked the South Library fire for the afternoon's reading hour. Mr. Trembath, the tenant farmer at the home farm, had come up at noon with his March accounts and gone down at 1. Mr. Pendle had sent in word at 2 that the parish coal fund subscriptions were laid up at the South Library cupboard against the Morning Post. Harriet set her pen at the Standish, lifted her eyes from the green baize, and looked out at the south sash window over the cool, pale yellow length of the Dart Valley. The leafless oak on the south slope was at the customary stillness of a Devon March afternoon. A jackdaw came over from the home park, settled at the upper branch of the leafless oak for the half-minute it required, and went away again across the south slope toward the Tavistock hills. The South Library clock at the mantelshelf was at the 3:30. The home farm sheep were at the long folding pen at the foot of the south slope, where Mr. Trembath had set them at first light, and the dart at the bend below the home park ran at its customary March fullness past the leafless willow at the lower meadow. She did not celebrate. She did not at the South Library writing table at the 3:30 of the 4th of March entertain any thought of triumph, nor any thought of relief, nor any thought of vindication. She was sensible only of a settled hush at the South Library window, of the leafless oak on the south slope, of the customary March hush of the parish of Withycombe in the Vale, and of the candid silence at the South Library writing table that had been the candid silence of her late godmother, Mrs. Trevanian, for the closing 6 months of her decline. She set her pen back at the Standish, took up the parish accounts at the coal fund column, where she had set them down at the Morning Post of the 9th of February, and went on with the column at the 3rd subscription of the previous Saturday. The afternoon clock at the mantelshelf went on at its sober Devon pace. The Felton withdrawal letter she did not refold. She let it lie at her left elbow upon the green baize, sober as the silver christening cup at the writing-table corner where she could see it. The last week of February at Trevanion Court closed in a thin, pale grey Devon damp, and the first true week of March opened in the cool, clear yellow light that the Dart Valley keeps for its earliest spring, and Harriet Wycliffe, sensible that the Sir Pelham matter was now at an end, and that the house was indisputably hers in law, and in fact addressed herself with sober gravity to the work of establishing herself in the parish of Withycombe in the Vale. Her week took its candid shape, writing table mornings at the South Library from the 9:30 hour until noon, estate walks with Mr. Pendle on the Mondays and the Thursdays at 2 o'clock, the parish school reading class on the Wednesdays and the Fridays at 3, at Reverend Locke's settled arrangement, the customary Sunday morning at St. Mary's, where the Trevanion pew at the south aisle had been kept for her these 8 Sundays. The reading class was the work she found dearest. 6 village girls came up to her at the parish schoolroom behind the rectory at 3 o'clock on the Wednesdays and the Fridays. Tamsin Tregells, the blacksmith's daughter, 12 years old, fair and sober. Ginny Polkinghorne, the widow Polkinghorne's only girl, 11, mid-brown and freckled. Damaris Trewin, the lay clerk's eldest, 14, dark and tall. Ursula Bray, the carter's middle daughter, 10, ruddy-cheeked and direct. Morwenna Skews, the shepherd's only girl, 13, soft-spoken and very sensible. And Grace Carn, the parish clerk's daughter, 11, slender and grave. They read together from Maria Edgeworth's parents' assistant, sitting in a half-ring at the long deal table at the south wall of the schoolroom. And at 3 afternoons through Lent, Harriet undertook to teach them the rudiments of French and a little Latin, on the candid view that a parish girl who could read her own Cicero in the cradle tongue of clerks might one day make a curate's wife or a steward's wife and be the better for it. The girls came in clean pinafores with their hair brushed. They spoke in the soft Devon accent of the Dart Valley. They were attentive at their lessons in the candid, sober manner of village girls who had been told by their mothers that the lady at Trevanion Court had taken a particular interest in their reading, and that they were to mind her with the same gravity they would mind Reverend Locke at his catechism. Harriet, sensible at the second week of the lesson that the gravity was perhaps a little heavier than was good for 10- and 11-year-old shoulders, eased the lesson with the candid Salisbury method she had had of her father, a half-hour of reading, a half-hour of French translation, and a closing half-hour at the south window over the rectory garden, where the girls might be set to compose a single careful sentence in their own hand at the day's lesson. The sentences, which Harriet read at the close of each lesson before dismissing the girls, were a candid Devon record of village life. Tamsin Tregells on the new lambs at her uncle's farm, Damaris Trewin on the church tower jackdaws, Grace Carn, with sober gravity, on the candid Devon manner in which her father, the parish clerk, recorded the burials in the South Churchyard Register. In the evenings at the South Library, Miss Esther Hibbert became Harriet's reading companion. From 7 to 9 each evening, the 2 young women sat at the South Library hearth. Miss Esther in her unadorned dove-grey print cotton, her sewing laid by, her sensible hazel eyes attentive, and read aloud, "Turn and turn about." They read William Cowper's Task at the opening. They passed on through to Edgeworth's Patronage in 3 volumes, and at the close of February they began the new Walter Scott novel, Ivanhoe, lately come down from the Tavistock bookseller, in 3 handsome cloth-bound volumes that Mrs. Hibbert had set in their proper place at the 3rd shelf of the South Library writing-table corner. Miss Esther read with a sensible Devon clearness. Harriet read in the careful clerical voice she had had of her father. And Mrs. Hibbert, at the hearth-chair, sometimes lifted her iron-grey head from her own work to follow a passage and lay it down again. Harriet found, in the candid, sober gravity of those evenings, that the company of a young woman of her own age, Miss Esther was a year older, having been born in the spring of 1796, was a comfort she had not known the want of through the long Salisbury winters at the schoolroom, and Miss Esther, who had felt herself the more solitary at the close of Mrs. Trevanian's life and at her own return from her Exeter post, was sensible at her side of a candid friendship she had not looked for. They did not speak of it in so many words. The two young women understood the matter between them in the sober Devon manner. It was on the cool, clear Wednesday morning of the 15th of March, at the 10:30 hour, that Mrs. Hibbert came up the South Library stair with a parcel in her hands. She set it on the South Library writing table at Harriet's right elbow, a flat box of red morocco, perhaps 14 inches by 10, brass-cornered, with a worn brass clasp at the front face, and said in her sober Devon manner that her late lady, Mrs. Trevanian, had asked at the close of the summer of the year, before that this box be put up safe in the long cupboard at the South Library north wall, and given to Miss Wycliffe at the day she had settled at the house, to her own satisfaction. "My dear lady was particular at the matter, miss," said Mrs. Hibbert. "She had said, not at her arrival, not at the early weeks, not at the first quarter, but at the day she had settled. I have watched these 8 weeks. I think the day has come." Miss Harriet, sensible of the gravity of the moment, set down her pen. She thanked Mrs. Hibbert in candid, sober gratitude. Mrs. Hibbert inclined her head and went out, drawing the South Library door to behind her. The brass clasp gave at the first careful press of Harriet's thumb. Within the red morocco box lay 4 things, set in careful order by an elderly woman's careful hand. The first was a thick bundle of letters, tied in faded primrose ribbon. 47 letters, Harriet found at her later careful count, in Mrs. Trevanian's own clear elderly hand, addressed each to "My dear Faith," and dated through the years from the spring of 1789 to the autumn of 1810. None had been sent. They were the candid, unsent record of Mrs. Trevanian's friendship with Harriet's late mother, kept across the 22 years that had separated the dear friends of Mrs. Champernowne's reading school after the marriage and the removal of Faith Traylor to Salisbury Close in the spring of 1789. The second was a pencil portrait, no bigger than a prayer book leaf, framed in a thin oval of dark walnut, Faith Traylor at 16, taken at Salisbury by some unknown Cathedral Close drawing master, the soft mid-brown hair pinned high in the fashion of the 80s, the sober hazel eyes very direct, the firm Traylor mouth at the faint beginning of a smile. It was the portrait the will had spoken of that had been hung above the South Library writing table. Mrs. Hibbert had taken it down at the death and laid it here, that Harriet might come upon it in the manner of a discovery rather than the manner of an inheritance. The third was a folded architect's drawing on grey paper, a Devon cob cottage of 4 rooms and a stone-flagged kitchen, with a thatched ridge and a small porch under a climbing rose, marked along the foot in Mrs. Trevanian's hand, "For Faith at the home farm, if she will come." W.T. June 1801. It had never been built. The drawing was crossed through with a single sober line of brown ink, ruled at some later date by the same hand, and dated below the rule. Withdrawn. March 1812. The month of Faith Traylor's spring fever. The fourth was a cloth-bound notebook of about 200 leaves, bound in unadorned dove-grey buckram, with a paper label at the front cover in Mrs. Trevanian's hand. Botanical Observations at the Home Farm and the Lower Dart Valley. W.T. 1798 to 1819. Harriet opened it at the first leaf and read the candid, sober opening sentence in the elderly woman's clear copy hand, it being the cool, clear Wednesday morning of the 4th of April, 1798, and the bog violet at the lower margin of the home farm, bog already in flower at the southward exposure. I begin this private record. Harriet read the 4 items through in the order in which Mrs. Trevanian had set them. Then she set them in their order back into the red morocco box, closed the brass clasp, drew the box to her right elbow at the South Library writing table, and resumed the parish letter she had been writing to Reverend Locke. She did not weep. She was sensible that the proper response to the long, candid, sober love of an elderly woman lately gone to her rest was not to weep at it, but to read it through carefully, in the candid, sober gravity in which it had been set down. She read the 47 letters over the course of a fortnight. At the 3:30 hour each afternoon, at the South Library writing table, with the pencil portrait set up at the writing table's right corner, where she might look at the young face of her late mother as she read. The letters were the candid, sober record of a friendship. They opened in the spring of 1789, in Mrs. Trevanian's 23rd year, at her father Sir Aldous' house at Trevanion Court, in the first weeks after Faith Treloar had married the Reverend Bartholomew Wycliffe and removed with him to his Salisbury curacy. They closed in the autumn of 1810, in Mrs. Trevanian's 65th year, 2 years before Faith Treloar's spring fever. There was much in them that Harriet had not had before. The small particulars of her late mother's courting at the Salisbury Cathedral Close in the summer of 1788, the wedding at St. Edmund's at Salisbury at the close of February 1789, the young motherhood at the Close, after Harriet's own birth, at the November of 1794. There was, in the letter of January 1795, Mrs. Trevanian's candid, sober account of the silver christening cup she had had made up by a Tavistock silversmith and sent up to Salisbury at the Christmas before the baptism. There was, in the letter of April 1801, the careful, candid, sober proposal to build the Devon Cobb cottage on the home farm, that Faith and her clerical husband and her infant daughter might come down to Devon for a part of each summer. And there was, threaded through the letters of the years from 1795 to 1810, Mrs. Trevanian's candid, sober love for her goddaughter Harriet, a love she had felt herself unqualified to press upon a young woman she had not met, but had kept warm in herself through the unsent letters, against the day she might at length be able to act upon it. She had acted upon it, in the end, by the will of the 8th of July, 1819. It was, Harriet thought as she read, a candid record of a kind of love that the modern fashion did not much understand, a sober gentlewoman's settled affection, held without expectation across the years, for the child of a friend she had lost. Mrs. Trevanian had not been a sentimental woman. She had been a Devon gentlewoman of her generation, settled at her father's house since her birth, settled at her husband's side at the same house from 1788 to his decease in 1801, settled at the home farm and the Lower Dart through the 18 years of her widowhood. She had not had children of her own. She had had Harriet's mother as the dear friend of her youth, and at the loss of the dear friend she had held the dear friend's daughter at the candid, sober centre of her heart, without saying so. The 47 unsent letters were the candid evidence. Harriet, at the close of the fortnight, did not weep. She copied 3 of the letters into her own commonplace book, in candid, careful copy hand, the April 1801 letter of the cottage, the November 1794 letter of the christening cup, the autumn 1810 letter of the last birthday her late mother had marked at Salisbury. She set the red morocco box at the South Library writing table's north corner, beneath the pencil portrait, which Mr. Curate, at her request, hung back in its proper place above the writing table. And she resolved, in candid, sober gravity, to continue Mrs. Trevanian's botanical record at the home farm. She took the red morocco box up to the rectory on the Wednesday afternoon of the 22nd of March at the customary 3:30 rectory tea. Reverend Locke received her in his south study, sensible at once from her sober gravity that the matter was of more weight than the parish business that was the customary topic of the Wednesday tea. He set down his teacup, took up the 2 letters she had marked for his eye, the April 1801 and the autumn 1810, and read them through in candid clerical gravity at the south study window. He set them down, took off his small gold-rimmed spectacles, polished them with the corner of his cassock, set them back, and said, in the gentle Devon voice he kept for the gravest of his parishioners' confidences, "My dear Miss Wycliffe, the matter squares with what I had heard at the rectory in October. Your late godmother had spoken to me at the rectory south parlour on the cool, clear Tuesday afternoon of the 19th of October, last, in the 3rd month of her decline, of her young Faith's daughter at Salisbury, and I had thought at the time that she meant some private connection of long sentiment, the particulars of which she was too modest to set out. I had not understood that she meant a goddaughter she had loved at a distance through the whole of that goddaughter's life. I understand it now." Harriet thanked him in candid, sober gratitude. Reverend Locke poured a second cup of tea for her. They sat at the south study window through the close of the afternoon, while the cool, clear Devon light slanted long and yellow at the Dart Valley slope. Lady Day Quarter Day fell upon the Saturday of the 25th of March, 1820. It was the first quarter day of Harriet's ownership of Trevanion Court. Mr. Pendle had brought the account books up from his estate office at the home farm yard on the Friday evening, and had laid them at the south library writing table at the 8:30 hour of the Saturday morning, that Harriet might look them over before the tenants came up. The home farm tenants paid their March rents at the south library writing table at the 10:30 hour. Mr. Trembath, the home farm yeoman, who had been at the home farm under Mr. Pendle these 26 years, paid the customary rent for the home farm. The widow Polkinghorne, who held the village tenement at Withycombe at a smaller rent, and who was Ginny Polkinghorne's mother, paid the customary rent at the South Library writing table in candid, sober gratitude for Harriet's continued countenance. Mr. Tregeagle, the cook's elder brother, who held the South Paddock cottage of the home farm at the smaller cottage rent, paid the customary rent and inclined his ruddy head in candid, sober respect. Mr. Pendle entered each sum at the Trevanion quarter-day account in his clean steward's hand. Harriet, at the close of the morning, signed the Trevanion quarter-day account at the foot of the page in her candid italic Harriet Wycliffe, and dated it beneath. Mr. Pendle took the account book down to the estate office. The first quarter-day under her own hand was complete. It was in the 2nd week of April that Mrs. Hibbert came up the South Library stair a second time, with a smaller parcel in her hands. This one was a flat, black-bound case, perhaps 8 inches by 5, of plain morocco, with a worn silver clasp at the front face. Mrs. Hibbert set it at Harriet's right elbow at the South Library writing table, and said in her sober Devon manner that her late lady had asked at the close of the summer of the year, before that this case also be put up safe and given to Miss Wycliffe at the day she had settled. The codicil to the will had touched upon it. The case contained the Trevanion family pearls, a parure of 2 rows of pearls of moderate worth, brought back from the late Sir Aldous' Trinity House service in 1795, and a folded slip of paper in Mrs. Trevanion's hand, to my goddaughter Harriet, at the day she has settled at Trevanion to her own satisfaction. W.T. July, 1819. The pearls lay at their dove-grey velvet bed in 2 even rows, the silver clasp at the back face worked in a slender Trinity House anchor. Harriet, sensible at once of the gravity of the second offering, accepted them in candid, sober gratitude, thanked Mrs. Hibbert by her name, and carried the black-bound case up to her dressing-case at the north wing chamber, where she laid it at the south drawer. On the Wednesday afternoon of the 12th of April, at the close of the parish school reading class, the 6 girls came up to Harriet at the long deal table at the south wall of the schoolroom, with their hands behind their backs and their faces sober at the sober gravity of what they had to present. Tamsin Tregells, who at 12 was the eldest by some months, brought from behind her back a small posy of Devon primroses cut at the south wood edge of the home park at her father's permission. Ginny Polkinghorne brought a candid, clumsy, embroidered handkerchief that the 6 of them had worked at jointly through the Lent afternoons, with a faint Devon primrose sprig in cream silk at the south corner, and the 6 initials in faded brown thread at the north corner: TT, GP, DT, UB, MS, GC. Harriet, sensible of the kindness, accepted them in sober Devon composure. She said to the 6 girls, to each of them by her own name in turn, that she was very obliged at the candid affection of the gift, and that she should keep the handkerchief at her dressing-case beside the Trevanian pearls and the posy at her South Library writing-table in fresh water for as long as the Devon primroses would hold, and she went to the South Library cupboard, took down 6 of the small cloth-bound Aesops that had been bound up at the Tavistock booksellers at Mrs. Trevanian's order in the spring of 1818, and presented one to each of the 6 girls: Tamsin, Ginny, Damaris, Ursula, Morwenna, Grace, with each girl's name inscribed at the inner cover in candid, careful copy hand. The girls, sober and pleased, took up their bonnets and went out at the south door of the schoolroom into the cool, clear, pale yellow Devon afternoon. Harriet walked back to the south porch at the rectory with Reverend Locke, who had stood at the door at the close of the lesson and seen the whole exchange in candid clerical pleasure, and they parted at the rectory gate at the 4:30 hour. It was through the second half of April that Harriet began the botanical work she had resolved upon. She walked the south paddock of the home farm and the bog at the southward Dart Valley slope each afternoon at the 3:30 hour, with Mrs. Trevanian's cloth-bound dove-grey botanical notebook at her right hand and a sharpened pencil at her left. She entered her own observations in candid, sober italic at the back leaves of the notebook, after the last of Mrs. Trevanian's own entries of the autumn of 1819, the marsh marigold at the lower south paddock at the cool Tuesday afternoon of the 11th, the cuckoo flower at the south wood edge at the cool Wednesday afternoon of the 19th, the bog violet at the bog's southward margin at the cool Friday afternoon of the 21st, in the same southward exposure that Mrs. Trevanian had recorded 22 years before in the opening leaf of the same book. She wrote at the close of the cool Friday afternoon entry, in her candid italic, continued, in candid sober gratitude, from W.T.'s own first observation of April 1798, H.W., April 1820. At the close of April, the parish convention, in the candid sober wisdom of an old Devon parish that knew how to mark the months of mourning of a young woman of modest establishment, eased Harriet's half-mourning to half-half mourning. The slate-grey wool of the long Salisbury winter was laid aside at the north wing wardrobe. Miss Esther Hibbert, who had been schoolmistress at Exeter and had a clear Devon eye for dress, attended Harriet at the careful selection, unadorned dove-grey wool with a clean white lawn fichu at the bodice, a sprig of cream Devon primrose at the bodice's south corner, the soft, mid-brown hair pinned smooth beneath an unadorned dove-grey cap with a clean white lawn edge. Easter Sunday fell upon the 30th of April, 1820. Harriet came down the north wing stair at the 10:30 hour in the new dove-grey wool, the sprig of cream Devon primrose at the bodice, Mrs. Hibbert at 3 paces behind her, in the unadorned dove-grey serge, with her own clean white lawn fichu. Mr. Carrick had the south door open. Mr. Pendle had brought the Home Park chaise round to the south sweep. The cool, clear, pale yellow Devon Easter morning was as fine a morning as the parish had had in 18 months. The morning service at St. Mary's was read by Reverend Locke at the 11 o'clock hour in candid clerical gravity. The Trevanian pew at the south aisle held Harriet, Mrs. Hibbert, Miss Esther, and Mr. Carrick. The Withycombe parish filled the body of the church and the north aisle. The cool, clear Devon light slanted in at the south windows. The Easter primroses set at the altar's south corner by the rectory girls were the same cream cut from the same south wood edge of the home park. Reverend Locke read the Easter service from the Book of Common Prayer in the gentle Devon voice he kept for the great days, and dismissed the parish at the noon hour with the candid, sober Easter blessing. It was at the south porch, in the moving press of the parishioners, that Harriet first saw him. He had stood at the back of the body of the church through the whole of the service. Reverend Locke, at his nod from the lectern at the opening prayer, had signified that he was a stranger to the parish, but that the parish was to take him in candid welcome. And he stepped from the south porch into the cool, clear, pale yellow churchyard light at the moment Harriet came out at Mrs. Hibbert's side. He was a tall, lean gentleman of perhaps 38, in unadorned dark walnut country morning coat, dark walnut hair cut close at the nape with a single streak of pure silver above the right temple, candid, grave mouth, faintly tanned at the brow with the look of a man much at his estate, deliberate hazel eyes of a remarkably dark amber hazel, the colour, Harriet thought at once, of the dart in autumn. He had the sober Devon air of a man who had not been at parish service in something above a year and a half. He inclined deeply at her, and at Reverend Locke at her elbow. Reverend Locke, sensible of the gravity of the moment, made the introductions in his candid Devon manner. Miss Wycliffe, may I make known to you Lord Ferdinand Vercombe, 5th Duke of Tavistock Castle 10 miles to the west of us. Lord Vercombe is the patron of 3 Devon livings, of which Withycombe in the Vale is one. Lord Vercombe, Miss Harriet Wycliffe, of Trevanion Court, the late Mrs. Trevanian's goddaughter and her legatee. Harriet inclined candidly. Lord Vercombe inclined a second time, deeper. He spoke in a sober Devon voice, lower than the curate's, the vowels longer at the close, and said that he had known her late godmother since the spring of the year 1812 as a candid neighbour of the parish, and had been gratified at the news of her bequest to her goddaughter when Reverend Locke had written to him of it at the close of December. He apologised, in candid, sober gravity, for the long interval at coming over from Tavistock to pay his respects in person. He had been delayed at the Tavistock Dower House these 3 months past by his late mother's gentle decline, the Dowager Lady Beatrice Vercombe being now in better health by his physician's last report, and having herself bid him at the Saturday morning to come over to Withycombe at the Easter service. Harriet, in candid self-possession at the south porch, the sprig of cream, Devon primrose at her bodice, catching the cool, clear Devon light, returned his bow at the proper depth, and said, "Lord Vercombe, I am sensible of your kindness in coming over." He held her eye for the space of a sober Devon heartbeat, inclined a third time, and stepped back to leave the parishioners their passage. Reverend Locke, in candid clerical hospitality, walked the two of them, Harriet at his right, Lord Vercombe at his left, the length of the churchyard path to the lych gate, speaking in his gentle Devon voice of the Easter primroses, and of the lower dart, and of the cool, clear, pale yellow weather the parish had been given for the great day. At the lych gate, Lord Vercombe inclined a fourth time at Harriet and Reverend Locke, took his hat from Reverend Locke's verger, and took his leave at the parish lane at 20 past noon. His own bay mare had been put up at the rectory stable at the close of the early service. Reverend Locke's verger brought her round. Lord Vercombe, mounted in the candid, sober Devon manner of a man much at his estate, lifted his hat once more at Harriet at the lych gate, and rode the parish lane west at the easy walk that was the Easter Sunday pace of the parish. Harriet, with Mrs. Hibbert at 3 paces behind her, walked the Home Park Lane back to Trevanion Court in candid, sober composure. Miss Esther Hibbert walked with her mother. Mr. Carrick brought up the rear at the chaise. The cool, clear, pale yellow Devon Easter Sunday lay long at the lane. The Home Park South paddock was full of Easter primroses. The beech avenue at the long approach was at its first true green of the year. At the south door, at the 12:30 hour, Harriet paused. She set her hand on the worn Devon granite of the south door jamb and looked west across the lower Dart Valley to the blue Tavistock hills. Sensible, in the candid, sober gravity that was her settled habit, of an alteration in her own life that she would not yet attempt to name. The hills lay long and blue at the western horizon. The Home Park Beech Avenue ran down the south slope to the lodge gates at the parish lane. The cool, clear, pale yellow Devon Easter light, slanting at the high noon of the great day, lay upon the granite of the south porch, and upon the cream Devon primrose at her bodice, and upon the long beech avenue, and upon the lower Dart Valley between Withycombe and Tavistock, with an even Devon evenness that Harriet had not felt at any hour of the 8 years since her late mother had died. She was 25 years old. She was a single woman of modest establishment, settled at her godmother's house, with 316 acres of Devon home farm at her own hand, and a parish that had taken her in candid welcome, and a household of 4 good servants whose names she had learned. She did not know whether the alteration she was sensible of at the south door jamb would deepen or recede. She did not know whether Lord Veracombe would come over from Tavistock again. She was sensible that she would not push the matter in either direction. She would let the candid, sober Devon weather of her own settled life carry her where it would. She did not name it. She turned, in candid, sober composure, and went in at the south door. The Devon April Easter Sunday afternoon closed at Trevanion Court in the candid, sober gravity of a parish in its settled quarter, and in the candid, sober gravity of a young woman who had come at length to her own. Saturday the 6th of May, 1820 came up at Trevanion Court in the cool, clear, pale yellow Devon weather that the lower Dart Valley keeps for its first true week of the month, and at 3 o'clock of that afternoon, the sound of carriage wheels at the south sweep brought Mr. Curate to the south door at his customary candid, sober pace. Lord Veracombe had sent his note by his own groom on the Friday morning. A single careful copper-plate half-sheet addressed in his own hand to Miss Wycliffe at Trevanion Court, asking whether it would be agreeable to her if he should pay his respects to her on the Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock, and saying that he would, with her permission, bring with him his late father's sister, Lady Maud Veracombe, who kept the Tavistock house for him at this season as proper chaperonage to the call. Harriet had answered by the same returning groom in her own candid italic that it would be agreeable to her, and she had asked Mrs. Hibbert to receive Lord Veracombe and Lady Maud at the South Library at the customary tea hour of 3:30. He came down from the chaise at the south sweep in unadorned dark walnut country morning coat, a tall, lean gentleman of perhaps 38, 6'1" and upright, dark walnut hair cut close at the nape, with a single streak of pure silver above the right temple, deliberate hazel eyes the colour of the dart in autumn, candid, grave mouth, faintly tanned at the brow from estate riding, the Tavistock ducal signet, a goshawk over an oak leaf, at his right hand. He handed down, at the chaise step, Lady Maud Veracombe, a slender lady of 68, iron grey hair beneath a white lace cap, sensible hazel eyes, 5'5" upright, in unadorned half-mourning dove-grey silk with white lace fichu, and gave her his arm at the south porch. Mr. Curate took their hats and Lady Maud's white shawl. Mrs. Hibbert came forward at the south hall in her unadorned dove-grey serge, with her clean white lawn fichu, the chatelaine of keys at her hip, and received them in sober Devon dignity. She showed them up the south library stair to the south library, where Harriet rose at the writing-table at the south sash window to receive them. Lord Veracombe inclined deeply. Lady Maud inclined at the proper depth of a lady of her years. Harriet, in her unadorned dove-grey wool eased to half mourning, the sprig of cream Devon honeysuckle, the cream Devon primrose being now gone over, at the bodice, inclined candidly in return. Mrs. Hibbert took her seat at the wing chair at the south sash window with her sewing. Miss Esther came in at the south library door at the half-hour with her own sewing, and took her seat at the second sash window 3 paces from the tea-table. Mrs. Tregeagle's tea-tray was brought up by the kitchen-maid at the proper hour. Harriet poured. Lord Veracombe spoke at the tea-table in the candid grave register that Harriet had heard at the south porch on the Easter Sunday. He had known her late godmother since the spring of the year 1812. His late father, the 4th Duke, had presented him at the Tavistock Dower House tea of that April, and had taken her at once for the sober neighbour of the parish she had been at every hour of her life. He had been gratified, at Reverend Locke's letter at the close of December, at the news of her bequest to her goddaughter. He was the more sensible of the propriety of the bequest, because he understood Miss Wycliffe to be the daughter of the late Reverend Wycliffe of Salisbury, whose brief discourse on country charity of 1815 his own late father had thought a sober, judicious work, and had given him at the time of his coming to the Tavistock title in the autumn of 1816. Harriet, candidly, acknowledged the connection. She had her father's pocket, Tacitus and his folio Bible at her writing-case at the South Library. She had not known until this hour that his small parish pamphlet of 1815 had reached the Tavistock Library. She thanked Lord Veracombe in sober gratitude. Lady Maud spoke once, in the candid Devon manner of a gentlewoman of her years, of her own remembrance of Mrs. Trevanion at the Tavistock Dower House tea of 1812, and twice of the cream Devon honeysuckle at the South Library window, which she observed Harriet had cut at the bodice in the proper Withycombe village manner. They took tea for the customary half-hour, and Lord Veracombe and Lady Maud rose at 4:20, and Mr. Carrick handed Lady Maud down to the chaise at the south sweep, and the chaise rolled back west along the parish lane toward Tavistock at the easy walk of the Devon afternoon. That had been the first call. Through the weeks of May and the weeks of June, Lord Veracombe came down to Trevanion in the candid, sober regularity of a Devon gentleman who had a purpose he would not press and would not abandon. He came on the Tuesday afternoons by the parish lane in his own chaise. He came on the Wednesday afternoons over from Tavistock on his bay mare. He kept the hours he had named in his second note to Harriet at the close of the first call, and he kept them through the 8 Tuesdays and the 8 Wednesdays of the 2 months, without an alteration of an hour. The Tuesday afternoon hour was the reading hour at the South Library, from 1 o'clock until 2. Mrs. Hibbert sat at the wing chair by the south sash window, with her sewing in the proper office of chaperonage. Miss Esther sat at the second sash window, with her own sewing 3 paces from the South Library tea-table. Harriet at the upright Devon cob chair at the south side of the long polished walnut writing-table. Lord Veracombe at the matching upright chair at the north side, the green cloth volume of William Cowper's Task between them. They read aloud from Cowper, "Turn and turn about." Lord Veracombe in a candid, sober Devon voice, the vowels longer at the close than the curate's, lower in the register than the curate's, deliberate at the long lines of the task, and Harriet in the careful clerical voice she had had of her father. At the close of the reading hour, at the stroke of the South Library clock at 2, they laid down the Cowper and took up Mrs. Trevanion's cloth-bound dove-grey botanical notebook from the north corner of the writing-table, and discussed the Dart Valley bog violets and orchids for the half-hour following. Lord Veracombe had a candid, sober knowledge of the lower Darts flora that Harriet had not looked for in a man of his estate. He had walked the bog at his late mother's company through the spring afternoons of his boyhood. They settled, between the 2 notebooks of late Mrs. Trevanion's hand and his own boy's record at Tavistock, the proper Withycombe names of 3 orchids the notebook had named twice in 2 different ways. The Wednesday afternoon hour was the Home Park Walk at 2:30 at the close of the parish reading class. Lord Vercombe came over the Home Park from the parish lane on foot, having put his bay mare up at the rectory stable. He met Harriet at the south wood edge at the half-hour, and they walked the south paddock and the lower beech avenue and the Home Park lane for the half-hour following, Mrs. Hibbert at 3 paces behind, Miss Esther at her own 3 paces behind her mother. They spoke of Lady Mariana's old walled garden at Tavistock Castle, which had not been planted in 3 years since her death in childbed of the autumn of 1817, and of the cream Devon honeysuckle that came up at the south wall of the Home Park in the 3rd week of May, and of the bog violets at the south paddock that were the same flowers Mrs. Trevanion had recorded at this hour of the year, through 21 springs of the lower Dart. In the last week of June, on the Wednesday afternoon at the South Library, Lord Vercombe asked Harriet, in his candid grave register, whether she might be at home to him at the south parlour on the Saturday afternoons through July, at the customary chaperonage. Harriet, in sober self-possession at the South Library writing table, acquiesced. The Saturday calls through July ran from 3 o'clock until 5 at the south parlour. Lord Vercombe and Harriet at the upright country chairs at the south parlour fire, Miss Esther 3 paces at the south sash window with her sewing, Mrs. Hibbert in and out at the South Library door at the proper interval. At the close of each call, at the stroke of 5, they walked the Home Park South Paddock for the half-hour, at the season at which the cream Devon honeysuckle was at full bloom at the south wall, and the lower Dart Valley lay below the Home Park lane in the long pale yellow Devon afternoon. They did not speak of his purpose. He held it in candid grave reserve. She held her own counsel. Saturday, the 5th of August, 1820, came up at Trevanion Court in the cool, clear, pale yellow weather of the Devon August. Lord Vercombe handed down at the south sweep at 3 o'clock at his own chaise. Mr. Curate took his hat. Mrs. Hibbert received him at the south parlour at the wing chair at the south sash window with her sewing. Miss Esther took her seat at the south parlour's second sash window with her own sewing, 3 paces from the upright country chair at the south parlour rug, at which Harriet was seated. Lord Vercombe came in. He inclined deeply at Harriet, at Mrs. Hibbert, at Miss Esther. He took from the inside of his unadorned dark walnut country morning coat a small green calf leather-bound commonplace book, worn at the corners, that had been his late father, the 4th Duke's, and he held it in his right hand, candid and unhurried, at the south parlour rug. He did not seat himself at the matching country chair. He went down upon one knee at the south parlour rug, in candid grave gravity, to be at her level at the upright country chair. And he spoke in the deliberate Devon register of a man who had set his words in careful copperplate the night before at the Tavistock writing desk and had committed them to memory. "Miss Wycliffe," he said, "I had not, when my late father first presented me to Mrs. Trevanion in the spring of 1812 at the Tavistock Dower House tea, foreseen what I was that afternoon acquiescing to. I have loved you with what dignity I could, and with what candid patience the 4 months have required, since the south porch of St. Mary's at Withycombe on the Easter Sunday of the 30th of April, 1820. I ask you now, on no other ground than that I have loved you steadily through the spring and the summer at the South Library Tuesdays and the Home Park Wednesdays and the South Parlour Saturdays, to do me the honour of becoming my Duchess. You have known me too short a time to be in love with me yet. I shall not press you on that. I ask only that you consider the question at your own time, and answer me upon your own terms. If your answer is no, my Tuesday and my Wednesday and my Saturday calls shall continue undiminished while you shall suffer them, and the question shall never, by my hand, be raised again." He closed the green calf commonplace book. He held it at his right hand at the south parlour rug. He waited at the level of her hand. Harriet, at the upright country chair, in candid self-possession at the south parlour rug, the sprig of cream Devon honeysuckle at her bodice, catching the cool, clear, pale yellow August light at the south sash window, looked at him at the deliberate hazel eyes, the colour of the dart in autumn for the space of one Devon heartbeat, and said, "Lord Vercombe, I shall." He inclined his dark walnut head once at the south parlour rug. He rose. He took her right hand in his right hand, the goshawk and oak leaf signet at his finger, and held it at his lips at the proper depth of the south parlour rug for the proper count, and set it down at her lap. "I shall write to your Aunt Mrs. Traylor at Bath this evening," he said, "and to Mr. Locksley at Lincoln's Inn at the Morning Post. The banns I shall have read at St. Mary's by Reverend Locke, and at the Tavistock Chapel by the Tavistock chaplain at the Sundays following." Harriet acquiesced in candid, sober dignity. Mrs. Hibbert at the wing chair set down her sewing once and took it up again. Miss Esther at the second sash window did not lift her eyes. The south parlour clock struck the half-hour. The banns were read at St. Mary's at Withycombe in the Vale by Reverend Locke at the morning service of the Sundays following, the 13th, the 20th, and the 27th of August, 1820. In the candid Devon clerical voice he kept for the gravest of the parish business, and at the Tavistock Chapel by the Tavistock chaplain at the same 3 Sundays. The Withycombe parish heard them in candid grave attention. The Tavistock household heard them in the same. Saturday morning, the 9th of September. 1820 came up upon the lower Dart Valley in the cool, clear, pale yellow Devon weather that the parish keeps for the great days of the calendar. At 10 o'clock of that morning, Harriet Wycliffe was given away at the chancel step of St. Mary's at Withycombe in the Vale by Mr. Locksley of Lincoln's Inn, her father, Reverend Wycliffe, being long deceased, to Lord Ferdinand Vercombe, 5th Duke of Tavistock, by Reverend Locke at the parish service of marriage, according to the Book of Common Prayer. The bride wore an unadorned cream Devon muslin morning gown, made by Mrs. Trembath, the village dressmaker at Withycombe, with a sprig of late summer Devon honeysuckle pinned at the bodice in the customary Withycombe village manner. The Trevanion family pearls, the parure of 2 rows of pearls of moderate worth, brought back by the late Sir Aldous from his Trinity House service in 1795, at the throat in candid sober dignity, her late mother Faith's silver locket worn beneath the bodice in candid filial remembrance, where no eye but her own should see it. Miss Esther Hibbert in unadorned cream-print cotton stood as matron of honour at the bride's right. Lady Maud Vercombe in her unadorned dove-grey silk with white lace fichu sat at the front pew at the north side. The Withycombe parish, Mr. Pendle, Mr. Carrick, Mrs. Tregeagle, Mrs. Hibbert at the second pew at the north side. Mr. Trembath, the home farm yeoman and the widow Polkinghorne, and Mr. Tregeagle, the cook's brother at the third. The 6 village girls of the parish reading class at the fourth, in clean pinafores, their hair brushed, sat at the back pews at the north and south sides. The Tavistock household sat at the south aisle pews. Reverend Locke read the marriage service in the gentle Devon voice he kept for the great days. Lord Vercombe spoke the responses in candid grave gravity. Harriet spoke them in candid sober self-possession. The Tavistock ducal signet at his right hand was set at the proper place of the service, beside the Vercombe gold wedding ring he had had from his late father's box at the Tavistock Dower House, and that the Tavistock chaplain had blessed at the chapel on the Friday evening before. He placed the ring upon her finger in candid grave dignity at the chancel step of St. Mary's, at the cool, clear, pale yellow Devon morning light. The wedding breakfast was at Trevanion Court at the South Library at noon. Mrs. Tregeagle had laid the long, polished walnut writing table with the Trevanion family plate, Mr. Carrick at the sideboard, Mrs. Hibbert at the door, Lord Vercombe and Harriet at the head, Lady Maud at the right, Mr. Locksley at the left, Reverend Locke at his proper place, Miss Esther beside her mother. The parish toasts were given in candid Devon sobriety. The Withycombe household and the Tavistock household took their breakfast at the South Hall under Mrs. Hibbert's hand. They went up the parish lane to Tavistock Castle at 4 o'clock of that afternoon in Lord Verucome's chaise, with Mr. Pendle and Mr. Carrick keeping the south sweep at Trevanion until the chaise was at the lower lodge gate at the parish lane's first bend. Mrs. Hibbert closed the south door at the 4:30 hour at the cool, clear, pale yellow Devon September afternoon light. The parish lane lay long and pale yellow at the lower Dart Valley between Withycombe and Tavistock, and the Home Park Beech Avenue stood at its long late summer green at the lower lodge. Tuesday evening, the 14th of February, 1821, at 9:30 at the South Library at Trevanion Court. A single trimmed lamp burning steady at the long polished walnut writing table at the south sash window. A low winter fire of seasoned beech on the marble hearth at low red ember. The Duchess of Tavistock, Harriet Verucombe, née Wycliffe, sat at the South Library writing table at the Trevanion ledger book, the February rents from Mr. Pendle's January quarter laid open at her elbow. Mrs. Hibbert had banked the kitchen fire and gone up at the 8:30. Miss Esther had laid down her sewing at the second sash window and gone up at the 9. The coal in the South Library grate settled with the same sober sound it had made on the Boxing Day morning of the curate's letter 408 days before. A year had passed. The estate was hers. She closed the ledger and went to bed. There are stories that begin with a kiss. There are stories that begin with a vow. There are stories that begin with a knock, and stories that begin with a hired post-chaise, and stories that begin with a will or a parish ledger or a still-room receipt. And there are, sober, longer in the asking, of the most candid patience in the answering, stories that begin with a Devon curate's letter, sealed in red parish wax on the 26th of December, 1819 at the rectory of St. Mary's at Withycombe in the Vale, carried up to Salisbury by the Salisbury and Exeter mail coach, opened at a schoolroom writing table at 8:30 on the Boxing Day morning of the 28th of December, by a young woman who had never met her benefactress, who set the curate's fool's cap upon the green baize at her left hand, and the silver christening cup of her dead godmother at her right hand, and did not weep. Stories that go on with the Lincoln's Inn will reading of Wednesday the 12th of January 1820 at 10:30 at Mr. Locksley's chambers at No. 7 Old Square, and the arrival at the rough-cast Devon granite of Trevanion Court at 4 o'clock on the Friday afternoon of the 21st of January, and Sir Pelham Trevanion's defeat at the South Parlour at 20 past noon on the Wednesday of the 23rd of February, and the second discovery of the 47 unsent letters of her late godmother to her late mother on the cool, clear Wednesday morning of the 15th of March, and the South Porch introduction at St. Mary's on the Easter Sunday of the 30th of April, and the South Library Tuesdays of May and June, and the South Parlour proposal of Saturday the 5th of August at 3 o'clock, and the parish wedding at St. Mary's at 10 o'clock of the Saturday morning of the 9th of September 1820, and the South Library coal settling at 9:30 of the cool, clear, pale blue Tuesday evening of St. Valentine's Day, the 14th of February 1821. And so, on the cool, clear, pale blue Tuesday evening of the 14th of February 1821, at 9:30 at the South Library at Trevanion Court, in the parish of Withycombe in the Vale, on the south-facing slope of the Dart Valley in the county of Devon, Harriet Verucombe's née Wycliffe, who had sat in candid self-possession at her schoolroom writing table on the Boxing Day morning of the 28th of December, 1819, and read through the candid sober letter of the Devon curate of St. Mary's, at the 8:30 hour without once shifting her position in the chair, closed the Trevanion ledger book at the long polished walnut writing table, and went up to bed.